From the City of Angels off the Pacific Ocean, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. Welcome to Coast AM. Next hour, are there ancient artifacts on the moon? Mike Vera joins us with his new work, Ancient Aliens on the Moon. Here's what's happening. While a satellite has gone down, the U.S. weather satellite that tracks the East Coast and Atlantic hurricanes, it's broken. Meteorologists are scrambling to fill lost data or for forecasters with a spare satellite and help a European satellite get more information over to them. The $500 million satellite was launched in 2006. It was not used regularly to monitor weather until about 2010, but it's got problems now. NOAA forecasters are estimating a 10 to 15% chance of M-class solar flares during the next 24 hours. They're watching Sunspot AR-1575. Okay, the maker of Trader Joe's peanut butter, tied to a multi-state salmonella outbreak, has now pulled dozens of additional peanut and almond products because of possible contamination. Sunland of New Mexico has voluntarily recalled 76 different products, including 3 brands of Trader Joe's peanut butter. Health officials are warning consumers not to eat specifically Trader Joe's Valencia Creamy Salted Peanut Butter after the product was linked to 29 infections in 18 states. Well, let's talking about states. Washington State, its first zombie bees reported. That's right, zombie bees reported in Kent, Washington. Now, a novice beekeeper returned home from vacation a few weeks ago to find many of his bees either dead or flying in very strange, jerky patterns and then flopping on the floor. He later learned that they had a parasite that causes bees to fly at night and lurch around erratically until they die. A biologist has discovered the infection. That was back in California in 2008. That biologist now uses a website to recruit citizens to track the infection across the country. Already, zombie bees have been found in California, Oregon, South Dakota, and now the state of Washington. The infection is still another threat to bees that need to pollinate crops. Hives have been falling in recent years due to the very mysterious ailment called colony collapse disorder, in which all the adult honeybees in colonies suddenly die. Here's Jeffrey Smith, expert on GMOs. He was just with me last week. Jeffrey, some people are blaming GMOs for the deaths of these honeybees. What do you think?
Well, the primary evidence falls on these neonicotinoid systemic insecticides that are used to treat the seeds, and then the bees lose the ability to get back to their hives. Now, with genetic engineering, we think that that might be contributing to the fact that this colony collapse disorder, it has higher numbers of bee deaths in the United States where there are so many GMOs. We know that when some bees were exposed to Bt pollen from corn, this is Bt toxin that's designed to kill certain insects but not bees, the bees that were exposed got a viral infection, whereas the controls didn't. So the Bt toxin might be compromising the immune system of bees. Also, bees are raised on high fructose corn syrup, which is from genetically engineered crops. Also, the genetically engineered seeds have higher levels of this neonicotinoid insecticide. So one way or another, GMOs are probably related.
Jeffrey, on Thursday, our investigative reporter Linda Moulton Howe was doing a story on genetically modified maize, corn, and apparently in some studies now, rats are developing huge tumors after eating this stuff.
Even 25% of their body weight. These are incredible-sized tumors. This was a study that was released in France on the 19th, and it turns out that it was the only most in-depth 24-month study. And most studies done on GMOs are terminated after 90 days, but most of the problems in this study showed up after 120 days. In this case, there was a much higher death rate, early death rate, among the rats that were fed genetically modified corn or Roundup or both. There were also massive tumors and organ damage, liver, kidneys, and pituitary. And this is the most significant research to be released in an animal feeding study yet, and it's going to be very difficult for Monsanto and the biotech industry and their supporters and regulation agencies around the world to defend against this new evidence.
All right, thank you, Jeffrey. And as I mentioned, Linda Moulton Howe, among the stories she'll be covering for us Thursday night, will cover that. A new respiratory illness similar to SARS virus has now spread globally. In 2003, it killed hundreds of people, as you know. Never turned out to be the pandemic they feared. But a man now has been identified from Britain. He's 49 years old. He's in a London hospital. He's the second person confirmed with what is called the coronavirus, which could be a mutation of SARS. Severe health in heart failure can cause the lungs to fill with fluid, leaving people feel like they are drowning, according to a new study. But the study also says that 80% of those adults are unaware of the heart impact on their life. That's strange. Discover Bank has agreed to refund $200 million to more than 3.5 million cardholders over claims of deceptive telemarketing. Apparently, they kind of misled consumers about additional products that they can be bought when opening credit cards. Sad story out of Massachusetts. Oh, my. A woman brings her cat to the vet to have a flea bath, but there's a mistake. The vet ends up euthanizing, killing that cat. He euthanized the wrong cat. Obviously, if you're a pet owner, you'll know how she feels. We're taking a look at what's ahead for the next month, the rest of the year. Art Rosengarten, of course, is a licensed psychologist and an expert in tarot card reading. Art, I wanted you to just quickly pull out the cards and just tell us what we have in store for us over the next month or so.
Okay, George. Nice to be with you again.
You too.
Well, it looks like we have the Hermit reversed coming up, which means being split off from others and kind of going into the self in somewhat of a dissociated, even slightly paranoid way. It appears like the energy in the collective is moving inward and pulling back from all the outer events. But what's really going on is people are just very burnt out with, there's so much happening.
Yeah, I agree. And you can sense it, Art, with just everybody you talk to.
Right. So there's just too much on the table right now, and I think people have had enough with everything that's going on with the elections and the world, et cetera. It's just too much energy for people to hold it comfortably. And what really needs to come out, I think, from the tarot, I'm going to pick the third card right here, is it's the Knight of Swords reversed. I think what needs to come out is we need to get our facts straight, and we need to calm down a little bit instead of charging out to do battle when we really don't have a great perspective on what's going on. We're a little bit overreactive and too amped up mentally.
Good point. Art's website, by the way, Art Rosengarten, GARTEN.com, part of our Twitter feed at coasttocoastam.com. Up next, we're going out into space. That's right, a night of space. Next hour, of course, Mike Barrett joins us, talking about his work about the possibility of artifacts on the moon. But Alan Stern joins us. He's a planetary scientist, and he's also a space program executive. We'll talk about space next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. I'm George Noory. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Alan Stern, a planetary scientist, space program executive, aerospace consultant, author. A few years ago, he's named to the Time 100, was appointed NASA's chief of all science missions, and in addition, he has been appointed the director of the Florida Space Institute, currently training to fly a series of suborbital space research missions. Alan, welcome. How are you?
Thanks, George. It's great to be here. I'm great. How are you?
Good. Hey, last week I had the opportunity to see the Space Shuttle Endeavour aboard at 747 come into California. And what a cool sight that was, Alan. It was unbelievable.
Didn't that knock your socks off?
Oh, my gosh, that thing's big.
Yeah.
It really, and just to sit there watching it go by, in imagining how often, 20-plus times, that it went into space, and the incredible journeys that it took, it was kind of sad also at the same time.
Well, yeah, that's right. The shuttle program's over. But, what occurred to me when I watched all those people turning out in L.A. and San Francisco, Tucson and Houston is, why weren't we flying these guys around the country and showing them off when we were operating the shuttle? Because people love it.
Yeah, they sure do. Now, tell me a little bit more about you, Alan.
Well, like you said, I'm a planetary scientist and heavily involved in commercial space flight. Used to be a government guy, but have emerged into the commercial sector.
Okay, now you have decided that the commercial sector, of course, is the way to go. A lot of companies, they're beginning to feel that same thing?
I think so. We're seeing a real flowering of commercial space efforts all across the country and in many, many different ways.
How so?
Well, for example, you mentioned suborbital, something we're heavily involved in at Southwest Research Institute. There are 5 separate suborbital space lines that are in development right now, from unmanned to human craft that'll carry people to space and back on short trips. We've got robotic spacecraft, commercial robotic mining missions planned to the moon and to asteroids. We've got billionaires planning space hotels. We've got other successful entrepreneurs, billionaires, that are building space capsules and brand new launch vehicles that break the price barriers way down relative to where they've been in the past. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Why are these companies and individuals so excited, Alan, about space and the future of space, and government seems to be pushing it away?
Well, actually, I think NASA is encouraging this in many respects. But I think the excitement is based upon a chance to really make a mark, to make a difference in the history of human beings, and to really see the next chapter in our development as a spacefaring society.
Do they see money with this?
Absolutely. You know, there used to be a saying, you know how to make a small fortune in aerospace? Well, start with a big one. But these guys that are starting these new space companies are primarily people who've made a lot of money in the past, for example, in the Internet. And they want to make even more because they see space as the next big development frontier.
Now, you've got a little company called Wingo, and tell me what its mission will be.
Right, Wingu. We just launched it in the last couple of months. And Wingu is a commercial space company of a different kind. We're not building vehicles and flying space missions, but we're actually going to be out there selling products to the public, and the proceeds go to fund space research and education. So we hope to create whole new ways, non-governmental ways, to fund the kind of research that comes out of our planetary program, from the Hubble, from other astrophysics missions, to help startup companies, even to help educators in the schools and the universities when money is tight, when budget cutbacks happen.
Where did you get that name?
You know,
I'm going to spell it, by the way. It's
Uwingu. It's like the word wing with a U at the beginning and
a U at the end.
Uwingu.
How'd you come up with that?
Well, it's a Swahili word, and it means the sky.
Ah.
It's an ancient word, and the products that we'll be selling, we hope, will be bought by people all around the world, in all the countries, and we wanted an international kind of a flavor to the name. And after all, it's kind of catchy, you know, the Uwingu.
I love it. What is it about the fascination with space? I'm sure you were fascinated when you were a little boy. I was. So many people have been fascinated, Alan, with what's going on out there in the universe. How come?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. I know I was swept off my feet as a little boy by the grandeur and the scale of it, and all wrapped up with the technology that was interesting to me and the heroes that were flying on the space missions and the feeling of the future that I would grow up for. And wrap all that together, it's a pretty powerful narrative.
Well, it sure is. You know, as you know, at this point, we have not been able to send humans back into space ever since the space shuttle program was retired. How long truly is this going to last? Well,
you know, we send our astronauts up on Russian vehicles now because we don't have any of our own. And then when they get to the space station, of course, it's an international space station with an American segment. But we're completely dependent in the United States on Russian space transportation to send our folks up there.
How expensive is that taxi ride?
It's very expensive, and it gets more expensive almost every year. I think it cost about $60 million for a launch of one guy or gal in a seat just to get up there.
Could the Russians ever hold us hostage? And I don't mean in a literal sense, but I mean, can they, really hold up our space program?
Well, they certainly have the valve on it, right? Because we only get as many seats as they allow, and we have to pay the freight for whatever charge, whatever price they want to put on it. But a better future is coming.
Tell me how.
Well, a couple of ways. First of all, beginning probably early next year, these suborbital lines will start to fly. These are purely American companies that will be launching initially test pilots, but soon space tourists, researchers, and educators in record numbers into space for short trips, admittedly, but it is going to dominate the way that we think about spaceflight for a long time.
Do you envision the day, Alan, where people will be in a plane? They've been testing things that did not work the last time they tested, but, maybe able to fly from Los Angeles to New York in an hour? Is that conceivable? Maybe even less?
I do think that's coming. I don't think that's around the corner in the 20-teens, and maybe not even the 2020s, but I'm sure it's coming.
2030?
We'll see. Hope so. It sure would be nice to be able to cross the ocean in an hour.
Yeah, it would be. Now, would that be expensive? I'm sure it would be.
I suspect it would be, just like the Concorde was expensive. But there's another future that's coming as well, and that's the development of private space taxis by companies like SpaceX and Sierra Nevada and Boeing. And NASA knows that they need to get their own transportation system in the form of rockets and capsules to replace our dependence on the Russians, and they have wisely been funding the development of these vehicles now for some years, and they're much less expensive than the Russian systems, and we're going to have our own capability again, just like we did with the space shuttle, probably by about 3, maybe 4 years from now.
I've got to ask you, too, as a planetary scientist, Alan, so many people have over the years been on our show talking about the possibility of this extra planet in the solar system, a planet X. There have been all kinds of theories, of course. Do you think that another object could be out there somewhere, a pretty good one, an Earth-size object, for example, that we just don't know about?
I do, but in modern planetary science, we expect to find a lot more planets, including Mars and Earth-sized objects farther out. And the reason for that is the solar system we now know was really good at making planets in the early days. That's why we're finding so many Pluto-like planets by the dozens now. And as it turns out, as the solar system finished the formation of the giant planets, their gravity threw lots of the building block planets, the ones the size of the Earth and smaller, out to really distant orbits, which we only today are beginning to have the technology to find. This is called the Oort cloud. You may have heard of it.
Sure have.
I like to call it the solar system's attic. It's where all that stuff was thrown up there in the attic billions of years ago, and we're just starting to find it. And I think a lot of planetary scientists are expecting that we will find not one, but potentially many Earth-sized, Mars-sized planets over time, way, way out there in the Oort cloud.
I'm sure as a planetary scientist, you have thought about the possibility of extraterrestrial life on those planets, somewhere out there. And, of course, if you look at the Drake equation and probability, you got to assume that maybe there are many civilizations, intelligent ones out there. Your thoughts?
Well, I don't work in the field of astrobiology, but certainly the numbers are humbling. When you think about the fact that in our galaxy alone, the best surveys so far indicate there are more than 100 billion planets, and just in our galaxy. It's just staggering.
It truly is. It's remarkable. And as a planetary scientist, let me ask you something about the formation of the planets. We have been pocketed by asteroids. It's obvious. We've been hit. The moon's been hit. All these planets have been hit. I think it's just a matter of time when we're going to get hit again. But why aren't there as many asteroids around anymore? I mean, obviously, if you look at the moon, the thing got pelted, and pelted in a big way. That's not happening nowadays. What's going on?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Correct observation. in the early days of the solar system, there was a lot more debris around after the formation of the planets. And the solar system has largely cleaned itself up today through two processes. One is the gravity of the big planets slings that debris away and clears the regions around the planet.
Hold on, Alan. Let's talk a little bit more about that, and we'll take some phone calls with you when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back with planetary scientist and space program executive Dr. Alan Stern. We'll take your calls in a second. Alan, I'll let you finish up about the dearth of the asteroids, where in the heck they all may be now. Go ahead.
Right. I was saying that, as you observed, there's less of them today than early on. Part of that's because of the gravitational clearing of the large planets, but also the planets simply soaked them up. They ran into a lot of them, and there aren't so many around anymore. All those craters are X-asteroids, evidence of X-asteroids, and every time we knock one off, there's one less.
They just keep coming. You there?
I'm here.
Okay.
Right.
All right. Let's go to the calls. Bill in West Hartford, Connecticut. Go ahead, Bill.
Yes. Hi, George. Hi, Dr. Stern. As George knows, I'm an amateur astronomer, and I'm the same age as George. I'm age 62, so I remember the Apollo missions, and of course, many, many, many unmanned planetary science missions and other unmanned missions. And one thing George Noory didn't mention, and this is the first of my two quick questions, is you are, I know, the principal investigator of the New Horizons mission to Pluto that's going to fly by Pluto. So I'll ask my two questions together. Question number one, is it true, and I'm assuming this is, but I've never heard this said in any publication or space.com or whatever, isn't it true that the New Horizons mission will be the fifth mission added to the two Pioneers and the two Voyager missions that will escape our solar system to orbit the Milky Way galaxy? And question number two, on the NASA manned spaceflight program, Lori Garver said a week ago, and this was on Aviation Week and Space Technology, that we're going back to the moon. What she meant was not to land on the moon, but what she said was, I think that possibly as early as 2019, with the SLS, the Space Launch System, the new large rocket that's comparable to the Saturn V rocket of the 60s and 70s, and it will be larger and more powerful than the Saturn V eventually, will send astronauts possibly as early as 2019 out to the Earth-Moon Lagrange Point 2 to stay there for 3 weeks to a month in a habitat module, part of the International Space Station, and then go back to the Earth as a precursor to going to an asteroid and eventually to Mars. Would you comment on both of my questions?
Sure, happy to. Well, yeah, I lead New Horizons, the first mission to Pluto. It's a NASA spacecraft going out there, and you're right. New Horizons will escape the solar system. We are going fast enough to completely escape the sun's gravity after we leave Pluto and the Kuiper Belt. And you're also right that we will be the fifth spacecraft to do that, following the two Pioneers and the two Voyagers. Absolutely. On the subject of the human space flight, of course, Lori Garver is number 2 at NASA. She's the deputy administrator, very talented executive and longtime space person. And NASA is looking at the capability with these new large launch vehicles like the Space Launch System and the multipurpose crew vehicle that used to be called Orion, to have the capability not just to go to one destination, but to many, to orbit the moon, to go to the asteroids, to the Lagrange points that are the gravitational balance points between the sun, the moon, and the Earth, all those places. And I know that NASA is looking at options like the one that you just described. And I expect once these systems come online, you'll see a whole series of exciting exploration missions like that. And you may even see private industry getting into deep space exploration. So hold on to your hat. The future's going to be bright.
It's going to be exciting, isn't it?
It really is.
Well,
I think it's the most exciting time yet. Spaceflight really is for the 21st century. Probably born a little bit ahead of its time because of the Cold War, but now we really have the technology. And with the birth of commercial spaceflight, where we see all this new innovation, new types of space vehicles, lower prices, much greater proliferation of flight rates, I think it's just going to get better and better.
You know, one of the things that has baffled me, Alan, we got to the moon in 1960 technology. Here we are now in the 2012 technology. Don't you think if we decided to go back to the moon, we could do it in an instant?
You know, it's been a matter of political will. And unfortunately, we got trapped in a bad cul-de-sac in our space policy. The only way we knew how to do it was the 60s way with big government programs. And sometimes we had the wrong president, sometimes the wrong Congress, sometimes the wrong NASA administrator. It seemed like we never got all the tumblers right. I think that's about to change because we're seeing this breakout in human spaceflight, where you see private programs beginning to grow on their own that don't require permission from the president or the Congress. And that's very important because you're right, we do have the technology, we do have the capability, and frankly, in the private sector, we can do it more quickly and less expensively and probably with the same or maybe even greater safety because the flight rates will be higher. And just like with the airlines, the more you fly, the better you can get at it.
Well, look what they did with Curiosity. I mean, an incredible amount of technology to get that device on Mars.
Absolutely, and a very, very complex system. Hats off to JPL for putting that together. Of course, it went way over budget, but they really did a spectacular job of making it work, and now we have this fantastic laboratory rolling around Mars.
Let's go to Linda in Windsor, Canada on the wildcard line. Hey, Linda, how are you?
Hi.
Good.
I hope I can. Hope you know something about this little book here. It's called the OERA, the Aura Linda book. Have you heard of it?
I have not. How about you, Alan?
No, I haven't.
What's it all about, Linda?
Well, I've come across it, and it said that it's a piece of old manuscript that in 2193 BC that there was an asteroid hit on the Earth. And at that time, it was a very highly intelligent. We were really, I guess probably where we are now. No, we were really up there in technology.
And got wiped out, huh?
Yeah, well, it said that there was, I don't know if entirely wiped out, but it said here that there was only 4 little words that could actually assure today, the scientists, is that the sun rose higher. And they said that was proof that the Earth's axis was tilted by this impact.
Well, Alan, if there was a life-ending situation that occurred on this planet millions and millions of years ago that probably wiped out any kind of remnants of who we might have been, that's conceivable. I've thought about that a lot.
Well, the thing is, we would probably have a lot of evidence of it in the geological record. We know a lot about past climate of the Earth. We know a lot about what was where the continents were. We know about the development of life over time, and we don't see any evidence for any of that. We know that asteroids have hit the Earth. They killed off the dinosaurs, for example. Pretty good evidence for that. But we don't have evidence of these past super civilizations. And I'm a skeptic on that because, I'd like somebody to show me real hard data, not just rumor, not just something written in a book that people know about, but hard facts.
What do you think's beyond Pluto? Anything else out there for us?
Well, we know our solar system goes beyond where Pluto is. We used to think of the outer planets as being the giant planets, but now we know that was really what we call today the middle solar system, and it's really at Pluto that the Wild West begins. That's the region of the solar system where we're making so many discoveries. For example, large numbers of small planets. We never expected that. And then further out in the Oort cloud, lots and lots of debris planets that were thrown out there are expected to be found. We may find planets that have oceans on the inside and even life inside those oceans in the future. It's really a very different place than when I grew up and was first taught astronomy, and it just gets more and more exciting.
Let's go to Carl in Grants Pass, Oregon, first-time caller. Carl, go ahead. Thank you.
Good morning, George and Dr. Stern. Love your program, George, but I find it difficult to be up at that hour. But my question is... Well,
you can be a Coast Insider, by the way, and you get it podcasting. It's waiting for you in the morning, but go ahead.
If we keep sending all these people out into space and they're requiring oxygen and water, there's no trees out there to replace it. And I understand that the quantity of water on the Earth is a fixed quantity. So are we going to end up with a lot of space pollution and end up with the Earth gradually put out into space?
I don't think you have to worry about that very much. We're really an infinitesimal little speck in the universe, and the amount that we bring with us is just so tiny compared to what's out there. By the way, one of the major building blocks in the outer solar system, surfaces of most of the planets in the outer solar system and most of the moons, covered in water ice. It's just incredibly abundant, vast amounts of water ice already out there. So the little bit that we bring along for a few humans at a time is really just a drop in the bucket.
Okay, thanks, Carl. Appreciate you being part of the program. And now we go to Cincinnati, one of my favorite towns. Hi, Sid. Go ahead.
Hey, George. I was curious about what was going on with what happened with the UFO in China and us and all that. What happened with that?
We're still working on that, and hopefully we'll do a show on that in the not-too-distant future. Interesting story there, Alan. In Veterans Today, a periodical, the senior editor was writing about a joint Chinese-U.S. Ship mission in the sea, in the Pacific Ocean, trying to monitor something that could be extraterrestrial. Interesting story. Let's go to Jeff in Birmingham, Alabama, east of the Rockies. Hi, Jeff. Go ahead. Jeff, you're with us? Nope, he's not. Let's try Dan in California. Go ahead, Dan.
Hi, George. Excuse me.
Sure.
My question is, okay, say they have an asteroid that hits the moon, kind of like the one that's going to hit Earth. Let's just say if it hits the moon, what effect would it have on the moon and the Earth? And I'll take my answer offline.
Well, the most common asteroids to hit the moon today are the same as the ones that would hit the Earth. They're relatively small. They would typically be in the range of a few hundred meters to perhaps a kilometer across. They'd make an awful big hole in the ground, another big crater on the moon. They would cast up debris that would fly suborbitally around the moon. They might create a melt pond from the heat of the impact right at the site of the impact, where we would have sort of a lava field for a short period of time, probably a bunch of vapor that would create a short-lived atmosphere around the moon. But that would, this is a normal occurrence. Rocks fly in space, and as you know, the moon is a witness plate. All those craters are former asteroids, and there are always more of them. So this is a pretty normal event. In fact, across the solar system, we see craters. So impacts are a ubiquitous process. When they hit the Earth, it's more of a concern because of our ecosystem, because of our civilization. They could cause a lot of damage if they were to hit where a city is. For the ones that are just hundreds of meters across, they can't knock out our species the way that the very much larger object that hit, that killed off
the dinosaurs
did. But, in the solar system, smaller means more common, and larger means much rarer. For example, we only have one giant planet, Jupiter, but we have lots of Pluto-sized planets. And similarly, we have very few large asteroids that hit the Earth, but a much larger number of small ones. So the most likely impactors are the relatively small ones. You wouldn't want it to hit your city, but if they land out in the middle of nowhere, and most everything is the middle of nowhere, then the damage would be pretty limited.
What happened to Mars, Alan? We all know it had oceans. We don't know about the specific life forms that may not have been there, but what happened to the planet?
Well, there certainly was, it looks like a lot of water in the early days at Mars, and we don't know whether it went underground or whether it escaped to space because of Mars's lower gravity, or some combination of those two things. And we need more missions to find out. In fact, what we really need are to send geological field expeditions.
Sure.
We need to have astronauts exploring Mars.
That's right.
And that's the way that you really come to understand that history.
Well, the fact that it had oceans means that the planet formed in some form or fashion the correct way, right?
Well, it sure looks like it had oceans. There's a large body of evidence for those. Still not airtight case, but it looks that way to many scientists. And, right way is a relative term. For those of us that like oceans, I guess it's the right way.
You got to love the water.
An equally interesting question is, what the heck happened to Venus? Same size as the Earth, same density, same basic bulk composition, just a little warmer, a little closer to the sun, but it sure went haywire. And with that runaway greenhouse is now 700-plus degrees on the surface.
Yeah.
Rain, sulfuric acid, just an awful place by terrestrial standards. Makes Mars look like Miami Beach.
Could it be too close?
Too close to the sun?
Yeah.
Well, there had to be more than that happened. Climate modelers can show you that with computer models, that just its orbital position can only be part of the story. There must be more to it in terms of the trapped greenhouse gases that caused this runaway heating.
Did something hit it?
We don't know. Again, we need more missions.
Because, Velikovsky says it's a captured comet.
Well, Velikovsky said a lot of things, and most of them have not turned out to be right.
Next up, George in Apple Valley, California. Hi, George. Go ahead.
Hey, I'd like to ask your guest if there was a privately owned observation platform in space, if he thought the government would allow any photos of UFOs to be released to the public.
Now, that's an interesting speculative question for you, Alan.
Well, I think we're going to see that very soon. That is, we're going to see privately operated astronomical observatories in space, the ILOA, the International Lunar Astronomical Observatories, Planetary Resources. Other groups are planning private telescopes in space. The B612 Foundation is another good example. We're going to have lots of telescopes in space feeding lots of data back to us, and most of it's going to be available for just about anybody on the Internet to look through for a price, and that's the key, because just like anything else in our society, whether you want a steak and you go to the store or you want a car or a ticket to a basketball game, these are going to be for fee, and you're going to pay to play. But then anybody that wants to look through that data and see what they can find is going to, the only thing between them and the data is going to be capitalism. And I think that's going to be a good thing.
Alan, how do people find you? Via the web?
Well, I guess you could just Google my name and take it from there.
That's simple enough. Dr. Alan Stern, we've got a little link up for you on some NASA work that you do. If NASA found indeed some kind of life, do you think they'd announce it?
I think they couldn't wait to announce it. NASA is a very open organization and loves making discoveries, and that would be the greatest discovery probably in the history of the space age.
Okay, let's go to Chuck in Wichita, Kansas, east of the Rockies. Chuck, squeeze you in real fast. Go ahead.
Okay, I was calling you about cold fusion process. They canceled the space shuttle program, and one of the main ingredients used in the program is helium-3, which is very rare on Earth, but there's tons of it on the moon. And I was told that they could bring back enough in the shuttle to provide the process. And they canceled the program. I wondered whether that was political or what, because Big Oil has tried to keep cold fusion from being developed because it's like free energy. And one of the guests was supposed to come on Coast to Coast one night. I forget, way back a little late.
Dr. Gene Malavis.
Yes.
Yep.
Was murdered before, and they raided laboratories and everything else, And I just wondered what your thoughts on that was.
Well, I think that there are a few things there that I ought to try and straighten out, if you don't mind. First of all, the shuttle was never capable of going to the moon. It could only get a few hundred miles up.
And that's
the moon is 1,000 times further. Secondly, the helium-3 that we do know is on the moon will be useful someday for fusion reactors, but we don't have fusion reactors. Those are hot fusion. Of course, cold fusion was debunked a long time ago. Unfortunately, it didn't work out because it was just bad science. But the reason the shuttle program ended is, frankly, because NASA's on a fixed budget, and in order to have money to develop these exploration systems, the capsules and rockets that'll take us back to the moon, on to Mars, to the asteroids, they had to trade away the shuttle program and its expenses.
Yeah, that's the trade. Alan, thank you so much. Good luck in everything that you do. Up next, Mike Barra joins us with his work, Ancient Aliens on the Moon. Well, if you have a second before Mike Barra joins us, get up to the coasttocoastam.com website. Take a look at some of the pictures on the moon that he has sent over to us what Master Lex has them posted now. Fascinating. They're under the highlight reel. We'll be back in a moment with Mike Vera as we talk about his latest work, Ancient Aliens on the Moon. And welcome back to Coast. Mike Vera, author, screenwriter, self-described born-again conspiracy theorist. He began his writing career after spending more than 25 years as an engineering consultant for aerospace companies, and he was a card-carrying member of the military-industrial complex. In 2012, Mike is coming back now with Ancient Aliens on the Moon, which is his in-depth artificial study of structures on the moon and the secrets behind it. And here he is, back on Coast to Coast. Mike, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good, George. I'm sitting here, basking in the glory of maybe the greatest ending to a Monday Night Football game ever, as far as I'm concerned. That's just
that's the way it is, huh?
I actually am going to make a prediction tonight that whichever presidential candidate comes out first and denounces the use of replacement referees is going to win Wisconsin.
Well, there was quite a stir about that, huh?
Yeah, it was a pretty wild game. I had a great time. Of course, I'm in Seattle. I'm a Seahawks fan, so it was. It came out the right way as far as I'm concerned.
Hey, are you concerned about earthquakes out that way? Because every expert that I've had on Coast to Coast, Mike, talks about that.
Well, it's interesting because we had Mount St. Helens erupt here in 1980, and at the risk of letting people know how old I actually am, I remember that. I very distinctly remember some of the eruptions that took place, in the days afterwards, and the big, gigantic ash clouds that were generated and all that. And the truth is that apparently, historically, both St. Helens and Mount Rainier, which is much closer to Seattle and much larger, have erupted at around the same time, or in cycles that are usually within 20 years of each other. So, that's apparently something you should really be concerned about up here. And the Indians even have very, very old legends of Mount St. Helens and Mount Rainier having a war of fire at times in the past, like in the 1600s. So, it concerns me, it worries me, but, I've been in L.A. for a long time. I'm going to be heading back to Los Angeles first of the year, and I'm actually going to be there in a couple of weeks with you at the...
Well, you're going to be on my panel at Conscious Life.
That's right.
I'm looking forward to that. You, by the way, always do a great job up there, Mike.
Thanks. I appreciate that, and you always do a terrific job.
And Richard's going to be there.
Yeah.
Mr. Hoagland will be on the panel, and that's going to be fun.
And there's not going to be much air left in the room by the time...
Well, when Richard gets on a panel, all I have to do is introduce him, and then I can go to dinner and come back and wrap up the panel.
Now, I know he's listening. So
I know. That's why we're saying this.
That's right. We're teasing him just a little
bit. He loves the fact that we mention his name anyway.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do it again because he was your co-author in Dark Mission,
sure,
The Secret History of NASA. Then you moved into The Choice. But tell me about the one we're going to spend a lot of time on tonight, Ancient Aliens on the Moon. How did this come about?
Well, it kind of got to the point where, it's been a couple years and it's time for me to write another book. And I was spending a lot of time doing a lot of the Ancient Aliens program. I know you've done quite a few episodes yourself. And I just felt like it was really there's a lot of energy around it. And I actually think it's kind of connected to stuff that I talked about in The Choice, which is that we're in this energy field, this sort of apocalyptic energy field. And what that means is that veils are being lifted and things are being revealed. And Ancient Aliens, I think the popularity of the show is part of that. So I thought, there's a whole generation of younger people. I started getting a lot of Facebook friends that were in their 20s that were coming on and had never heard of any of this stuff. And I said, to myself, Dark Mission wasn't that long ago, but there's a whole new generation of people out there that have never heard of any of this stuff. And the other part of it was that Dark Mission's very technical. It's very complete, very thorough. It's 650 pages. It's almost as big as War and Peace. It's big and it's thick and it's technical. And I thought, there really is a need out there for people that have not ever really heard of this stuff to have a smaller, more specifically focused look at ancient aliens and their presence on the moon, and really, the fact that the show kind of typically spends most of its time on stuff on Earth. There's a whole bunch of evidence of ancient aliens on the moon and on Mars, and And I felt like, hey, there's a chance here that people, an opportunity for people to learn some things, a completely new audience that hadn't really heard of this stuff.
I like the fact that you dedicated the work to Eric von Daniken, Zecharia Sitchin, and Richard Hoagland.
Yeah, the big three.
The big three.
The thing is, without those guys, without the three of them, none of us would be talking about this stuff. And they are all giants of this field. And it's really kind of funny because the book is actually published by Adventures Unlimited Press, which is David Hatcher Childress's, publishing arm, and he wrote Extraterrestrial Archaeology. So I thought about it later. I thought, wow, did I sort of diss my publisher on this? I didn't mean to, but those three guys are the anchors. They are the ones that have given us the best information, I think, on the ancient alien question, starting with von Daniken.
Well, let's talk about these three individually for a moment here, Mike. Eric von Daniken, of course, his claim to fame, Chariots of the Gods, was on the program with me several months ago, lives in Switzerland, and a lot of people just think the world of his work. I ran into a fellow from Peru yesterday, and we were talking about the Nazca Lines, which, of course, was the body of that Chariots of the Gods story. But give me your thoughts on Eric von Daniken.
Well, he's really the pioneer of all this. And again, the Nazca Lines, you brought it up, he's the one who really was the first to popularize them. Now, others obviously had researched this stuff before, but he's the one who brought it to the forefront. I can remember there was a film, Chariots of the Gods, I believe, back in the early 1970s. And, I was just fascinated by that. And Eric got blamed for a lot of things that I think weren't his fault. There were a lot of things that were claimed to be errors that really weren't errors. And it's really interesting as you look back on his work and all of the things that he brought people's attention to, just the way that he was sort of attacked and debunked by the Carl Sagans of the day and other people, Philip J. Klass and people like that, who kind of really went after him. And it's really been a consistent pattern of anybody who tries to question, as John Anthony West puts it, the myth that we went in this basically straight line from stupid cavemen with their stone knives and their bearskins to smart modern man with our striped toothpaste and our hydrogen bombs in one straight line. And anybody who's argued that, no, there's some other evidence or there's some other possibility of intervention along the way, or that we didn't go in just one nice smooth curve to where we are now, gets really raked over the coals. And, I think that he was a very courageous person for being the first guy to step out on this limb. He took a lot of heat for it over the years.
He sure did.
But the truth is, I think it's all coming back to him now, because now people are beginning to understand and appreciate his contributions and how many innovative things he brought to the forefront.
The late Zecharia Sitchin, of course, was another one when he wrote his Earth Chronicles, namely The 12th Planet, which I could not put down, Mike, when I first read it. Yeah, it's a great book, and again, it's a seminal work. Along with Chariots of the Gods, it's a seminal work in this what do you want to call it? Basically, in this field that we're in, and he really took apart a lot of the Sumerian myths and legends and showed that there's a great deal of evidence that they're not myths and legends. And, ultimately, even though I think there's some argument that he's been wrong about certain interpretations, and some of us do think that he's a little bit too literal in some cases and not quite literal enough in other cases when he does his interpretations, the truth is it's really hard to look at the evidence he presents and say that it amounts to little or nothing. It actually amounts to quite a bit, and it's a fascinating history of the human race, an alternate history of the human race, and told by the people who apparently actually experienced it and lived through it. And again, he's someone who's, I think, really been vindicated by especially the mitochondrial DNA results, which show that, modern man, you and me, we're only about 200,000 years old. And according to all the evolutionists, the people under the Darwinian delusion, we have to be at least 2 or 3 million years old, and we're nowhere near that. So it strongly implies intervention, and it strongly implies that, his work has been, for the most part, vindicated. Although I hope that Nibiru is not anywhere near, and it's not coming around again for a while. And then again, we have Mr. Richard C. Hoagland.
Mm-hmm. And again, here you have The Monuments of Mars, another seminal work, another masterpiece of this field. And where Richard took it was, okay, you can take these same theories and ideas, and they also apply on other planets besides just the Earth. And of course, the main part of the work was at that time was the planet Mars. And I understand, I had a conversation with him earlier tonight, I understand he's got some really juicy new stuff about Mars that we're going to be seeing at the Expo in a couple weeks in L.A., and it just keeps going on and on. We keep learning more and more information, and the more that we get, to my mind, the more the original thesis that he had is confirmed. There was a time when people, if they thought that there was evidence of an ancient civilization on Mars or even a current civilization on Mars, they were completely off the deep end, and there was nothing to support that. Well, in the last 25 or 30 years or 40 years or however it's long he's been at this, I guess 30
Oh, my gosh.
Now. Yeah, 32 years. I just want to make it
longer than both you and I have been born.
Way longer than me. Oh, yeah, like 4 times longer than me, and at least 5 times longer than you.
Yeah.
But as long as he's been at this, the evidence just keeps getting stronger and stronger that this is the case, and that we do have vast evidence of a vast civilization that was once active on Mars, and who knows, in some circumstances, there's even a few places it looks like the lights might still be on. So, again, these guys are giants of this field, and you wouldn't even have any Ancient Aliens programs to put on TV if it wasn't for the three of them. So I just wanted to applaud them and dedicate the book to them and say that, they have all inspired me, and I wouldn't be talking to you if it wasn't for the three of them.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the moon, and before we get into artifacts, of course, give me the theories that are out there, Michael, including yours, on how you think the moon was formed.
Well, there's really 3 different competing theories, and they all have pretty big problems. The original theory that everybody kind of went with was the fission theory, which was that the moon had been siphoned off from the Earth, and there was a thought for quite a while that the Pacific Basin was where all this material had been tossed away. The reasons for thinking that might be the case are pretty valid if you really look at it, because the moon appears to be made up of basically what's called light mantle material, or material from the upper crust, not the upper crust necessarily, but to be technically correct, the upper crust and the upper mantle of the Earth. It has a very, very small core, which the heavier, denser elements would sort of, collapse to the core, and it has a very small core, which indicates that not much of what the moon is made of came from these heavier, denser materials. So all that stuff seemed to really fit pretty well. But where the issue came up was the general consensus that there was not enough spin energy or angular momentum. And again, in The Choice, in my last book, I talk a lot about the importance of spin energy and angular momentum, but there wasn't enough of it to have supposedly siphoned the moon off from the Earth. So that was kind of thrown out after a while, and then everybody went with the accretion theory, which is one of the theories of how the solar system formed, which is that basically just clumps of matter begin to sort of glue themselves together, and they start spinning, and they collect dust and debris and other clumps of matter, and then they collide with each other and sort of form these planets and moons. But again, that theory doesn't really work because the collisions would probably be destructive, not constructive. And I kind of just don't think the accretion theory makes any sense for a whole bunch of reasons, those primarily included. So then they went with the third theory, which is the big whack theory, which is the idea that a Mars-sized object smacked into the Earth, endless billions of years ago, eons ago, and broke a big chunk of the Earth off, and it spun away. And
is there evidence for that? If you had to put the moon back into the planet, would it fit like a puzzle?
Well, it would fit to a certain extent, but it depends. Everything, of course, would recondense after that, so it would be misshapen like a big hunk of Play-Doh on one side of it if you tried to do it. But the truth is that theory doesn't fit either, because if that was the case, then the composition of both bodies would be different. There would be some mixture between the third planet and the Earth and the moon isn't made up of anything except the exact same stuff that the Earth is made of. So it kind of that theory's kind of now out the window.
But they do believe Earth was hit by something.
Well, they do believe Earth was hit by something, but, I think...
And, strangely enough, Sitchin writes about that in his 12th Chronicle book.
He does, but the problem also is how do you get this massive amount of material in this completely very, very stable orbit, very close to the Earth? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. The Earth doesn't really have enough gravity to really have captured that. And, of course, there's also the capture theory, which I don't think anybody really believes in at all, which is that the moon was just wandering by and somehow got...
Or as John Lear would say, towed in.
Towed in, yeah. So you really have all these conflicting theories. Now, Dr. Tom Van Flandern, the late Dr. Tom Van Flandern, was a big believer in the fission model of planetary formation, and I'm an advocate of it. And I tend to think that the right answer is something along those lines, that it was spun off from the Earth at some point in the primordial days.
While it was forming.
But again, all of this, interestingly, all of this is dependent on whether we're actually getting the truth from NASA about what everything is made of, and that's really, really highly questionable.
Why does our moon, this is what I believe, right? Our moon is the only moon in the solar system that orbits the sun rather than its parent planet. Is that true?
Well, it is true depending on kind of how you look at it. Basically, it was Isaac Asimov that came up with this idea, and what he did is he looked at all the different moons in the solar system and how they were all pulled, towards their parent planet or towards the sun. And what he said was basically that the moon's orbit around the Earth is always sort of concave to the sun. And the end result is that he said, it's the only planetoid or the only satellite in the solar system that does not actually ever really be it's actually orbiting the sun rather than orbiting the Earth. It's a bizarre situation, but Asimov came up with it and he did the calculations for it, and nobody has ever disproved what he came up with. So it is a very bizarre situation. It's almost as if the whole thing is there by design. And again, I talk about this a little bit in Ancient Aliens on the Moon and in The Choice. You have this arrangement where it's exactly 2,160 miles in diameter, and an age of the precession of the equinoxes is 2,160 years.
Mm-hmm.
Those are really interesting numbers. And then the moon is exactly the right size and exactly the right distance to create perfect total solar eclipses. And how do these things happen by accident? And, of course, many people don't believe that they're an accident.
That's right. Well, it also gives us on this planet total harmony, doesn't it?
It does, and and again, this is kind of going back to the field physics of The Choice, but it's a situation where it creates this balance in our consciousness and in our physical reality. I mean, Jim Birkeland's a big advocate that the moon causes earthquakes. And, I as I documented in The Choice, it does definitely seem to affect our consciousness.
That's right. Oh, no doubt.
Eclipses have an effect on physical instruments like free-swinging pendulums and even electronic devices. So EMTs
will tell you, Mike, on full moon nights, it's their busiest time.
And bartenders will tell you that, it's crazy on full moons, that the energy is bizarre, but again, it's not something commonly accepted by science, but then, the term lunatic came from basically the effect that the full moon had on people.
We're almost all water, aren't we?
Yeah, pretty much.
And it pulls. Mike, stay with us. Mike Barer, our special guest tonight, Ancient Aliens on the Moon. When we come back in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM, we're going to have Mike go back into history and tell us about some of the strange things people have reported on the moon and how. We'll be back. Well, how would you like to sound off on Coast to Coast? That's right. Every Wednesday now, a lucky Coast to Coast listener gets to sound off. All you have to do is send your submissions to what you think editorial at AOL.com. Simple as that. Include your name and phone number, and Tom will give you a call back, possibly, and we'll get you recorded, and you can sound off. And welcome back. Mike Barer with us. Mike, let's get into some of the history of lunar observations. What have people been reporting over the eons?
Well, really as far back as observations of the moon have been reported, there's been really unusual stuff that's been seen. I think it was 1178 that there were some monks from Canterbury that saw what some people think is probably the formation of the Giordano Bruno crater, where something hit the moon and the moon throbbed like a wounded snake. They said it was kind of a crescent moon, and that there was a blackish appearance all over the planet. So people have seen really bizarre things, but William Herschel, the famous British astronomer, Sir William Herschel, once spotted 3 glowing spots in what he called the dark part of the moon, which would be pretty danged unusual to be able to see anything glowing in the dark side or the dark part of the moon, the shadowed part. And these things were seen, they were observed. One place that seems to really have a lot of this kind of activity is the crater Aristarchus, which I've actually got an image of that, a color image of Aristarchus in the book, and it's in the photo gallery that I've got up on my blog. And it's a very bizarre, very bright formation, and it's just really kind of hard to explain what some of these might be. There's all sorts of color and illumination changes. There's very, very bright flashes, some of them lasting for a few minutes or a few hours even. Very famous Russian astronomer Nikolai Kozyrev, who again played a big role in Dark Mission and in The Choice, made an observation of what he called an eruption around Alphonsus crater. Mm-hmm. And so he took some spectrometer readings, and some people think that this stuff is outgassing of stuff that's been trapped in pockets on the moon. Some people think it's sort of interaction with the solar wind. There's all sorts of different ideas, but there's maybe just one that makes the most sense anyway to me. So then it's none of those.
All right. So Richard Hoagland is listening because he's sending me messages. And he wanted to thank you, by the way, for dedicating the book to him and the other two, Eric and Zechariah. Okay?
Okay. Well, I appreciate that very much, and he'll get his copy of it in L.A. in a few weeks when we're all together down there.
Now, he also has a theory about the moon. He says that it could be covered with enormous glass towers.
Yeah.
What's your take on that? You agree with him?
Well, after years of going over the information, I have to say that I absolutely do. I have seen his evidence. I've gathered evidence of my own. I've done my own enhancements of images, and what you see pretty consistently is this very bright, reflective material that appears to be above the lunar surface, and in many cases it's miles and miles above the lunar surface. There's lots and lots of images that show this stuff. And as you enhance it and overexpose the images, and Richard has done this, since the mid-'90s, and me and other people have done it more recently, what you see is that there's a specific geometric patterns that emerge in this structure that is sort of towering over the moon's surface. And you also see that it follows the proper geometry of scattered light. There's a couple of images that recently I was looking for something else. I was looking for a particular object called the dataless ziggurat, which I think we're going to talk about later. And I did some enhancement work with the images that had a couple images that had that object in it. And again, this bright reflective sort of halo appeared over the surface of the moon. It almost looks in some circumstances like an airglow layer, like the atmosphere of the Earth looks from orbit, which of course is impossible because the moon does not have an atmosphere. So then the question becomes, what exactly are you seeing on these images, and how do they follow the geometry of scattered light if it's not really there? I mean, if it was just some sort of photographic anomaly, it wouldn't follow the curvature of the moon. It would follow some sort of internal lens flare type of geometry. But the reality is this stuff seems to be there, and it seems to be in most places around the surface of the moon, and I'm pretty well convinced that theory is correct, that there are these, so in some cases, 10, 20-mile high glass structures still hovering over the moon and intervening between the camera and the surface in some cases. You get these very weird effects where you look at the surface of the moon and you should see absolute crystal clarity, and instead you get this very blurry, weird kind of effect. And again, I think that's an intervening medium, a semi-transparent medium. And the truth is, if if light from the sun were to strike the panes of this stuff and be reflected back to an observer on the Earth, that's exactly the kind of effect you would get with these transient lunar phenomena, with the observations that have been made. And they would be multicolored, like are described by Herschel and some of the other witnesses, because you get basically light being bent and slowed down and scattered all over the place by these gigantic panes of glass, which kind of act like prisms. And you end up with a very different picture of what the moon must look like from the surface.
Is it possible that some kind of atomic blast formed the glass out of natural, substances on the moon?
Well, it's possible there's some glass like that on the moon. Again, there was something that they found in the Apollo missions that they called the glazed donuts. And actually, what they were rocks or packs, very densely packed lunar dust that had been literally glazed over and formed into glass shapes by some very, very intense, very, very hot reaction at one time. Now, that could be caused by something like a nuclear detonation, but the general conclusion about the so-called glazed donuts on the moon was that they were probably caused by a very, very powerful, very, very intense solar flare where the sun suddenly put out about between 100 and 1,000 times more energy than it normally did.
Jeez, so that would have been an X-50 or something. Huh?
Yeah, so just for a few seconds, and I think the dating on that was around 12 or 13,000 years ago, so or within the last 20,000 years. And again, I cover that in detail in The Choice. I don't really talk about them much in Ancient Aliens on the Moon, but it's pretty scary because it means that the sun can send out flares like that, and you generally really don't want to be in the path of something like that, for sure. But I don't think that's what this stuff is that Richard has pointed out, because what you can see is you can see engineering structure in it. I mean, I can see, layers, I can see girders, I can see support
Yeah,
struts.
It's not a natural anomaly.
No, it looks like architecture and it looks like engineering. And, and George, the weirdest thing, which we can maybe talk about later, the weird part is it looks like human stuff. I don't know what alien architecture would look like, but this doesn't look like that. It looks like stuff that we would build if we had the technology to do it.
What if we did build it, but a long time ago?
Well, that makes a lot of sense because, the Hopi talk about the three previous worlds of man, and I think they point out that the last world that was wiped out in the flood was a very advanced civilization where we saw, technological inventions even far beyond what we've come up with today. So it is entirely possible that we're looking at the remnants of that human civilization. I mean, after all, maybe Neil Armstrong meant exactly what he said when he said that's one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind. And maybe what he was telling people or signaling through the noise of the moment was, I'm just a man, I'm a modern man, and that's one small step for me, but for all of mankind, this related, previously highly advanced, who knows, again, maybe we can go back to Sitchin and call it Anunnaki, mankind that we're part of the family of, genetically related family. It's a giant leap because we're now returning back to the stars from whence we came. So it's entirely possible that the late Neil Armstrong really meant exactly what he said and he didn't make an error.
You kind of allude that somebody made a meteor shield out of glass on the moon.
Yeah.
Why would you use glass?
Well, that's what the purpose of these gigantic glass structures are, is to provide a meteor shield. And the biggest reason you would use glass is because in a vacuum environment like the moon, where there is no atmosphere, then glass is about twice as strong as steel. It's actually
really? I didn't know that.
Much tougher. And the biggest reason
does it
why
just
glass,
shatter?
Well, yeah, it doesn't shatter so much because the reason that glass is weaker, that it shatters on impact here on the Earth, is because there's moisture in it. The Earth is a very wet, very moist place, and you can't get the moisture out of the glass. But in a lunar environment, you don't have that problem. So you can actually take not only the extant lunar glass that's already there, but any other glass you were able to cobble together from the available materials would be incredibly strong. And in fact, there's actually a couple of studies, part of the Bush 43 lunar initiative, when they talked about going back to the moon. One of the ideas that was discussed was that we would manufacture habitats out of lunar glass precisely for that reason. So when you look at these structures, I see anyway, these giant layered scaffolding type of structures. And then below that, over craters and depressions and stuff, there are actually some domes. A friend of mine, Steve Troy, and who's worked with me and Richard for years, actually has a picture of what looks like very clearly sort of a watch crystal, kind of a classic dome, over a crater in Mare Crisium, a couple craters, Cleomedes F and Cleomedes FA, and there's actually some other pictures I show in the book where it looks like there was once sort of a watch crystal kind of dome over the crater Picard, which is a very prominent crater in Mare Crisium. So you have glass up top in sort of a square scaffolding kind of structure, and then below that you have these very tight encased watch crystal shapes. So it makes a lot of sense. It's like a multiple layers of protection, and it would act in a sense almost the same way that an atmosphere would on Earth, the way our atmosphere protects us from meteors. So it's actually the perfect material to build a meteor shield out of, at least if you're living on the moon.
Would you be in shock if mankind had been to the moon back in, millions of years ago?
Yeah, a little bit.
You would?
Yeah, I would a little bit. Well, it wouldn't be mankind. You put it perfectly because it would be mankind. I would be, but again, I look at stuff. I've got some pictures that that again we can look at in the web gallery. We can get to later as we go over this. There's stuff around the crater Copernicus that looks. I mean, it looks like the rebel base from The Empire Strikes Back. There's like these buried wheels and things. This is not my discovery. It was somebody else, another guy, but who I'm not going to mention his name, although I did put it in the book, but I'm not going to mention his name here because he doesn't like the publicity. But, it looks, there's no question that they're artificial wheels or something, and that they may be generators, they could be any number of different functions, but there's absolutely no question. It looks like, again, like stuff we would build. It looks like our architecture, only on a scale that's pretty much unimaginable, based on our technology today.
Alan Bean, astronaut Alan Bean, had some artwork. Tell me about the significance of this.
Well, it was really significant. This is really cool stuff because
strange stuff.
Well, the thing is, when I work with Richard very closely, this is stuff that he picked up on Dark Mission, and and when we're working together, when we would work on things, you would find out like a factoid, or you'd look at a picture, or something would come across to both of us, and we'd talk about it a little bit, and you'd say to yourself, "Gosh, I know this is important. I just don't know why." And one of the things that was like that was Alan Bean's paintings. Now, Alan Bean, for those of you who don't know, was the fourth man to walk on the surface of the moon. He was on Apollo 12, and he was, a very competent test pilot and an astronaut, and they went there to an area called Oceanus Procellarum.
Is he the one who did the golfing on the moon?
No, that was Alan Shepard on Apollo 14. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, although it would have been cool if he was. But he was, in our political context that we put Dark Mission, and the big difference between Dark Mission and Ancient Aliens on the Moon is not only that Dark Mission covers stuff besides the moon, it's a political book, and Ancient Aliens on the Moon is just about the ruins. But Apollo 11, we felt like, is really a symbolic mission. There was really nothing anywhere near those guys. They put them down in the safest place they could find. They did it specifically because there was a ceremony to be performed.
Yep. They wanted to get them there, get them off as fast as possible.
And do their Masonic ceremony and get the heck off the moon. Now, Apollo 12 was different. They actually landed in some place that I think that they were pretty well aware that there were these glass ruins all around them. And Alan Bean, when he got back, he had his trip to the moon. He was debriefed. They were hypnotized, like most of the astronauts were. Hypnotized to help them remember, George, quote unquote. And afterwards, he basically retired from NASA after another mission and started painting. He became an artist. And he painted himself on the moon. And when he initially painted these self-portraits of him in his spacesuit, the lunar surface was flat and dull and gray, just like you see it in pretty much all of the press release photos that NASA has ever put out and the films of what the surface of the moon looks like. It was very, very flat and very boring. And then he started to experiment, and he started to add more color. And he kept going through these iterations because it just never felt like it was quite right to him until he finally got to this last iteration. I think this is the fourth version of his self-portrait on the moon, and all around him are the lunar surface is pink, magenta, lavender, blue, some very odd green colors, and it's just you're looking at this going, wow, that's a really weird way to imagine the moon. A few years later, Richard and I are doing some investigations. Richard is looking at the area around Apollo 17, and especially in Shorty Crater, and he starts doing a little bit of playing with the color on this stuff, and he starts enhancing the color. Now, I want to be really specific. All he ever did really was turn the volume up on the color. He didn't change the color. He didn't do anything with it except just make it a little bit more saturated, a little bit more colorful.
Oh, so he's an artist, right?
And, well, yeah, but it's not even an artistic thing. It would be just like anybody listening to us. You just turn the gain up. You just say, okay, Mike and George aren't loud enough. I'm going to turn the volume up. So that's what he did. And when he did that, this whole area around Apollo 17, the rocks and the mountains and everything in the background and everything in the foreground becomes pink and lavender and magenta and green and blue and yellow and all of these bizarre colors, and it looks exactly like Alan Bean's paintings. And the really weird thing about it is that the explanation for that is actually pretty logical, which is, again, that if there are these towering glass structures overhead, then light is going to be hitting them and going through multiple layers, and it's going to be slowed down by these glass prisms, essentially. And when that happens, colors will mix together. Two bright, basic colors, red, green, and blue, will mix together, and they will form pink and green and purple and lavender. So really, Alan Bean's paintings are a confirmation of the color enhancement work that Richard did, both of which are I think, a confirmation of the model that there are these gigantic glass structures in a lot of places on the moon, certainly on a lot of places on the front side. But then you have the bigger issue, which is Alan Bean trying to tell us something, or did he just not remember clearly? And later on in life, as the effects of whatever they did
wore off.
Yeah, wore off. But there's, it's way beyond any kind of coincidence that he would pick these exact same colors, because there's nothing about the moon as NASA presents it that would even imply these kinds of colors.
Pretty dramatic, isn't it?
Well, it is, and again, if you asked him directly, what would he say? I don't know. There are some statements he's made about how I just was looking at different ways to put color in, but I tend to think he's really operating from the subconscious. He's got a subconscious memory of what he saw up there, and the only explanation for it is that there's this artificial stuff all around the landing site, and that's what was causing all these very strange colors. And of course, there's lots of other confirmations of this. I mean, the very first landing on the surface of the moon by the United States, Surveyor 1, when it came down, they took 3 pictures, one with a red filter, one with a green filter, one with a blue filter. They put them all together, and the surface of the moon was green and red and pink and purple, and they're like, oh, something.
Hey, Mike,
wrong.
hold on. We're going to come back with you in just a moment here, talk about the possibility of a domed-like structure on the moon. Well, and tonight we have Mike Barrow with us, author of Ancient Aliens on the Moon, and we'll get deep into his theories now when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. Okay, welcome back to Coast. Mike Barrow with us, author, Ancient Aliens on the Moon. What kind of structures do they have? Are they like domes, Michael?
Well, there are a couple of domes that I do talk about in the book, in the Mare Crisium area, and we talked about that just a little bit earlier. But there's these scaffolding structures, which, for want of a better term, we call domes. That's the much bigger meteor shield above everything, and then down below that, covering some craters, you actually have these very smooth sorts of almost like the watch crystal, a crystal on a watch, a very expensive watch. So they're really interesting, different types of structures as you look at all this stuff, this glass stuff on the moon. Now, in particular, this one was off of a
Mike, you're shaking your phone.
Okay, sorry. Okay. There was in particular one very specific image that was part of a sequence that was being taken on Apollo 15 as they were flying past Mare Crisium. It's really interesting. They didn't very often fly directly over Mare Crisium, and it's an interesting area of the moon because it's sort of shaped like a giant hexagon, which is kind of an unusual shape to get from a natural impact basin. And there's these things underneath various parts of the moon called mascons, which are these very heavy concentrations of mass that generate a lot of gravity. But at any rate, they were flying along on Apollo 15 and taking a series of photographs. And it's interesting because you can kind of see in the foreground the crater Picard, and he's taking one picture after another. And then they pass Picard, and they're now looking sort of to the northwest. And he takes a few more pictures, and then all of a sudden, the camera is switched back to the right, and they take another picture of Picard. It's almost as if he was sort of, looking out the window, and then for some reason turned back to his right and snapped another picture. And when you look at that picture on the very far distant north shore of Mare Crisium, what you see this very, very bright specular reflection. You see this incredible, brilliant bead of light. Now, that, again, is a telltale sign that you're reflecting off something that's very, very
tall,
bright, or crystalline. Right. Definitely glass, right?
And going up.
And, well, not necessarily going up, but it was definitely something that was a very, very specific pinpoint of light. Now, again, my friend in South Dakota, Steve Troy, did some sectional enhancements of this image, and I put them on my computer and scanned them. This was years and years ago. And you can actually see over these two craters, Cleomedes F and Cleomedes FA, you can see these two edge-on glass domes, and you can even see one through the other. So they are transparent as you look out across, maybe 100 miles away from the spacecraft. And it's just amazing stuff. And the more you look inside of those glass domes, you can also see some blocks and things that look very geometric. They look like some kind of structure. And it's just really bizarre. It's the kind of thing where you go to yourself, wow, am I really seeing what I'm seeing here? But there's no question in my mind that the astronaut was snapping pictures, saw out of the corner of his eye this bright flash of light, and then turned the camera back to take a quick picture of it as the spacecraft was moving over the lunar surface.
What do you think these structures outside of the shields, what do you think these structures were used for?
Well, they're probably habitats. I mean, it makes a lot of sense to cover up a crater and build inside of it and have some sort of habitat underneath there because, again, you can pressurize that. You can create an Earth-like environment. You can, if you need that, I don't know, if you're an alien, maybe you can survive in a vacuum. But
was it a colony?
Yeah, probably, very much so. But it's really bizarre because, again, this stuff, you can catch it from certain angles, and it looks very different than it does edge on. And if you look straight down on many parts of the moon, you don't really get any detail. You need light and shadow to sort of give you the crucial visual cues as to what you're looking at. Now, Richard has argued for a long time that there's no intact glass domes of that type on the lunar surface, but I think we may have found one or two of them still intact. And then the question is, if we could get there and land there, what would we find inside? I think that's a really fascinating question.
It sure is. Your interest in the moon, how did that happen, Mike?
Well, I've always been interested in space as long as I can remember, probably from the time that I was just a little boy. I used to watch the moon shots and the Gemini missions and all that stuff, even though I was 4, 5, 6 years old. So it's like a lifelong fascination with space. And I remember really distinctly watching Neil Armstrong's first moonwalk and really feeling a little bit bothered by the fact that the picture was so terrible.
It was horrible.
Yeah, I kept saying to myself, Dad, my dad was an engineer at Boeing. He'd worked on various different projects, including a little bit on the lunar rover. And I was talking to him, which didn't come till later, but I was talking to him and I said, Dad, why, we've got a color TV. Why don't they have color TV on the moon?
And we're getting this noisy black and white picture.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And what we found out later was that they had a very good color camera, but they were not allowed to take that to the lunar surface with them. They were ordered to leave it aboard the command module with Michael Collins. So they did have a color video camera that could have taken really, really good pictures. And I think I think in retrospect and looking back on it now, those guys inside NASA knew very well that there was a lot of artificial stuff on the moon, and they weren't really sure what you would be able to see or not be able to see. And so they basically gave them the worst possible camera. There were definitely protests at that time from people inside NASA. Why are we only taking a black and white camera? Why aren't we taking a good camera? Why aren't we taking, better color photographic film and that kind of thing? There was a lot of protests. And then furthermore on like Apollo 12, this is, again, a kind of an interesting situation. Now, Apollo 12, as we talked about earlier, it was Alan Bean's mission, where the idea was that they were going to land amidst these structures. So they kind of had their experience from Apollo 11. They kind of knew they couldn't see very much, especially with the way they actually downgraded the quality of the video. It was even downgraded from what was actually taken from the camera itself. By the time it got transmitted to our TVs at home, it was considerably worse than it looked when they first took the images. But on Apollo 12, they were right in the middle of this stuff. And had they really had a good, high-quality camera there, you possibly would have been able to see some of this glass stuff reflected in the background. But in a very, very bizarre accident, which nobody's really properly explained, Alan Bean did exactly the thing he was not supposed to do, which he was trained not to do, which is that he took the single video camera that was on a lunar module and he pointed it directly at the sun, and he burned it out. So there never really was more than just a couple of moments of video of the Apollo 12 astronauts.
How big were these structures, Michael?
Well, I think we're talking in some places 20 miles, at least 20 miles high. And there's a picture, there's an Apollo 15 picture which Richard found for Dark Mission, and I show it again in Ancient Aliens on the Moon. And it was just after the Apollo 15 trans-Earth injection, as they were flying away from the moon, looking back at it. They took a picture of the moon, and the frame number escapes me. And there is this bright greenish-blue glow, very soft, gauzy, hazy glow all around the surface of the moon, including, on the edge, creating this air glow layer. And from that distance, at that range, with the equipment they had, these structures would have to be many, many miles high. And there's even some really interesting Russian images. They're kind of crude, but they're from the Zond missions that I put in the book, and there's brand new versions of them online these days that show, in one case, this vertical tower. It looks like the Washington Monument sticking straight up out of the surface, and it's got to be 20 or 25 miles tall. There's just no way around it. It's gigantic.
It's amazing stuff. We're going to look at some of your pictures in just a moment here. But tell me about Apollo 17. You think it was a salvage mission?
Yeah, Apollo 17 is one that by that time, I think they had been to the moon. They discovered a lot of stuff. But Apollo 17 was a very, very different mission from all the others. It was the first one and the only one that really wasn't in the equatorial region. It was way up. And you're going to love this. It was at about 19.5 degrees north latitude, which, again, Mr. Hoagland doesn't think is an accident, and I don't think so either. And there was this they landed very near something called the South Massif, and Massif just simply means, it's a French word that means mountain, the South Mountain. And the South Massif has a very distinctive hexagonal shape to it. It looks like it was once a hexagon. Now, the back end of it appears to have been blown out, or some sort of volcanic eruption, and or was blown out in some sort of other type of accident. And as you look in great detail at this South Massif, what you see this very odd sort of geometric patterning on the inside of it, as if the whole thing was made up of a series of rooms and cells, and again, artificial geometric structure. It also has an opening near the front, or the north face of it, which is sort of a V-shaped depression. They call it a crater. NASA calls it a crater named Nansen. But if you look at it, it's a V-shaped depression. There's a kind of a shelf over the top of it, and it looks like an entrance. It looks like you could go down into this thing and go inside this gigantic hexagonal structure and look around at what's inside. And, we felt like very strongly that was definitely one of the targets for the Apollo 17 mission. And it turns out, as you go through their explorations, they were surrounded in Apollo 17. They were surrounded by what what are called arcologies, or architectural ecological systems, mountains that had been formed into what appear to be condos all around the Apollo 17 landing site, to the east, to the west, to the south, to the north. As you go through pictures and you look at the photographs that have been taken and you zoom up on the mountains in the background, you see these layers, these very square layers of what look like, again, condos, rooms, structures.
That's
buildings.
strange.
Yeah, built right into the sides of the mountains. And then on the second day, the second EVA that they went out on, they took the lunar rover and they made a couple of small quick stops to drop some explosive charges, and then they went straight for this entrance. They went straight for Nansen. And they parked the rover up above the opening so that you could not actually look directly into the opening. And then they spent about 20, 25, 30 minutes off camera, and the camera just sat there and sort of wandered around left and right and up and down, and you never saw anything that the astronauts were doing. Schmidt and Cernan were completely off screen. And again, the idea that occurs to me is, what the heck were they doing? And it's interesting because Cernan later says something along the lines of, well, we didn't really look around any more than you've seen. And what does that mean? Does that imply that they tried to get into this entrance but they couldn't? Does it mean that, we haven't seen anything, so you did try to get in? Because we didn't see them. They just were off camera. We don't know what they were doing. We heard them talking, but we didn't see them at all. And then they drive back down to another position where they would have had a perfect view to look up inside this entrance, this Nansen structure. And they even say in some of the Apollo surface journals that they were going to drive around in a circle and take a bunch of pictures, and they did. And there's all these comments of, Lordy, would you look at that? And my God, what a mysterious place. And, we better, we might have to hide some of the pictures, I think is something along the lines of what he says. That's not entirely accurate, but basically he talks about they're going to be freaked out when they see these pictures at home, and you can't find any of those pictures anywhere. They're not in any of the catalogs. If there are any pictures directly looking into this Nansen structure, I haven't been able to find them yet.
Do you think any astronauts have admitted this? I mean, we know Edgar Mitchell, Mike. He has never talked about this, Apollo 14.
The interesting thing about Ed Mitchell, and I don't know him. Richard knows him. You've talked to him.
Yet he believes we've been visited by extraterrestrials.
Well, the thing is, he's willing to admit to or cop to the stuff that you can never prove, which is that, I've heard that NASA knows all about aliens and UFOs and lights in the sky and what they are. But the truth is, you can never put your finger on that. The one thing that we could put our finger on, which is, hey, Ed, did you guys go to the moon and find technology and bring some of it back? He won't talk about that, or when he does, he categorically denies it. So I just find it bizarre that he encourages people to believe in the thing that can never be proven, but he totally poo-poos the thing that could be proven. And Apollo 14 is a little different than 17. I'm not sure they were right in the thick of things like they were with Apollo 17, but I find it hard to believe that there wasn't anything except rocks that these missions brought back.
What do you think the moon was being used for, Mike? And what time period might this have been?
No, the time period is the hardest thing to put your finger on, because some of this stuff looks like it could be millions of years old, because it's so beaten down and battered, and there's a lot of meteor activity, but that's a long time ago. Other stuff looks more recent. Other stuff looks like it was of a fairly recent vintage.
And being used now?
That I don't know about. Okay. You hear stories. I mean, I've got some hearsay stories. I know somebody who swears to God that as a kid, in the swimming pool, in the hot tub, his dad worked for a defense contractor, that some of the astronauts and people whose names we've mentioned on this program tonight talked about how they were just, we're just spamming a can, and hell, they've got all kinds of flying saucer technology. They've been to the moon and back and Mars over and over again, and they're just sticking us up there for a big public show. And they expressed a lot of unhappiness about that. So, I don't know. I can't put my finger on that. All I can tell you is that there is all kinds of artificial stuff left over all over the moon. I mean, it's almost everywhere you look.
Let's talk a little bit about Data's head.
Data's head.
I was at an event where Richard showed a picture of this thing. You had an integral part of that, obviously, Mike. Tell me about that. I mean, what is this thing?
Well, look, I'm going to.
And there's a picture of it, I think, in what you supplied us.
Yeah, there is. There should be a picture there. I give you guys links. There's also it's fairly famous by now.
It looks like a broken off robot's head.
That's what it is. That's, I think, what it is. I think it's a Cylon, and I mean, again, I'm going out on a limb in speculation here, but, again, I think that stuff that's in our media, like Battlestar Galactica, is real. It's some kind of racial memory. I think that we probably built these machines. The machines got out of hand. There was some sort of conflict, and that was what was part of what we're finding. Is we're finding the remnants of whatever this conflict was.
Well, this one obviously got blown up.
It did, and the thing is, it's a thing that looks like the head of a robot. It definitely appears. It's definitely not organic, because if it was organic, it would have eroded by now.
And there's nobody around it, right?
Yeah, and not to mention the fact that it has a painted red stripe across the upper.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. What the heck is that?
It's a painted red stripe. I mean, it's funny. There's some people out there, and Richard and I have our critics, and I guess all of us in this business do. But some people have tried to claim that you can't, you have to paint that on. You can't actually get it. And I'm sorry, I downloaded the raw images from or the scanned images from NASA's website, and just using the color tools just in Windows, you can just amplify the color, and this bright red stripe comes out right on the face of this thing, and there's nothing else like that anywhere in the picture. But there's all sorts of mechanical-looking debris. I mean, I have experience as a mechanical engineer in aerospace, and I see stuff all around this head that are not rocks. There's these weird pieces of machinery that appear to be all busted up, as if a big meteor obviously created the crater. And all these pieces of stuff got broken and shattered and kind of tossed up into the air and then settled back down to the floor of the crater. That's what it looks like. And all around it, there's stuff with connecting points, and I can see tubes and exhaust vents and just all kinds of stuff that clearly are not any sort of natural.
I mean, he looks like C-3PO, doesn't he?
Yeah, C-3PO. Yeah, that's what he looks like. And that's kind of weird, but I guess that whenever we create something, man has a tendency to make things in his own image, and why wouldn't you? So again, that to me is kind of implies the question, or begs the question, is this us? Are we seeing something that some other version of humanity built a long time ago?
It is remarkable. I mean, like the face on Mars in Cydonia, this too has a structure look to it, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And, again, I can't, it's definitely not a rock. It has a metallic sheen.
Whatever it is, it was on the moon when the picture was taken, right?
It was. Now, whether they brought it back or not is a good question. We talked about that a little bit in Dark Mission. I don't talk about that so much in Ancient Aliens. But the question is, could they have brought it back? Well, it's the size of a human head. I mean, it literally would have fit inside one of the space helmets. It would have easily fit in one of the rock bags. And, Shorty Crater does not look that steep. It looks like if they really wanted to go down and get this thing that they could have, or they could have brought back something like it, because there's other pictures from Apollo 17 where just a picture of the lunar rover, and then you see in the background, you see this thing that looks like a big, gigantic mechanical pump.
It's a great picture. We're going to talk more about the controversy on the moon, Mike, with you when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. Well, next hour, we'll take your phone calls with Mike Barra here as we talk about Ancient Aliens on the Moon. Fascinating subject tonight. I'm getting lots of emails from people who love what you're saying, Michael. We'll be back with you in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Noory with you. Let's get back to DataSet for just a moment, Mike, and we'll get into some of these other areas as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is truly bizarre. I wonder what the folks at NASA might be saying when they saw that picture the first time. What do you think? I mean, obviously, regardless of what it might be, it looks like a robot's head. Well, so were they laughing about it? What was happening?
The question is, did they see it? I mean, my experience with NASA is that if they see something that is on a picture or they know it's there, they will do their dangest to erase it before anybody else notices it. So I'm not sure they ever saw it. I mean, there were thousands and thousands of photographs taken. And that's a really good question, George. What would they have said about it? I think probably some of them by that point it would have been par for the course. It would have been okay, yeah, gee, another major artifact find. Ooh, oh, so what? Because I think by that time, we were already, it was the very last landing mission, and we were really getting ready to come home and really not do any space exploration and really kill the space program after that. So
could it be a skull?
I don't think it could be a skull for a couple of reasons. Number one, the lunar environment's very harsh. The radiation would have degraded anything organic in probably just really a few years, maybe, just a few years, much less a few hundred or a few thousand or a few million years. So I think it has to be mechanical. And then you've got the fact that there's this painted red stripe on it, which again, using simply the photo enhancement tools built into Windows, I can duplicate Richard's work on that. So I don't see how a skull is going to have a bright red, very sharp painted stripe on it. That's the weirdest part to me.
Let's get into the controversy now about the Daedalus ziggurat.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. You remember this came up. It came up, about 2 months ago, I guess.
Yeah. You were right in the middle of it.
Well, I was, because I was, looking around, actually looking at doing a search on Moon Pyramid on Google, and I came across this forum, which was discussing a lot of stuff about some of Roger Lear's lunar data and so forth, and somebody had posted this thing, and I remembered it from the 1990s. I've seen this thing before, and I remember it very specifically, and I think at one time I actually had a version of that on one of my computers, but that was, 1994, 95, 96, very early days of the Internet, and, how many computers have I gone through since then? I don't even know, and I'd lost it. So when I found it, I was like, wow, this is really interesting and really cool that this thing is surfacing again, and I wonder where it came from. Now, some people have said that it was some of my, harsher critics who cyberstalk me and follow me around like maniacs have said that it was put out by somebody named KK Samurai, who was the guy who put a bunch of stuff out in the late 90s, and they claim he's a hoaxer. But first of all, I don't ever remember him ever hoaxing anything that I can recall, specifically saying that I can say, oh yeah, he faked it. Number two, I saw it before he ever put it out, if he ever did put it out, and I don't really remember him ever putting it out. And the other thing is that he always signed everything that he did. Every image he ever put out, he always put his stamp on it,
right.
KK Samurai, and this does not have that. So I looked at that, and the first thing I noticed about it that I thought was really interesting is it had this weird pattern on it. Now,
well, paint us a picture for those who don't have computers with them.
Okay, well, so this thing is it's a very sharp close-up of an object that has this sort of V-shaped pointed front ramps on it, and then it has a very square sort of internal structure, and on the left side of it, in a shadowed area, you can see a very clearly defined left wall, which comes up at an angle. It has sort of a buttress on top of it, and then in the middle is a square structure, which looks like a temple. There is a ramp or some sort of entrance tube leading into this square structure, and on top of the structure is a dome. So you look at it, and it looks exactly like a Mesopotamian pyramidal structures that were known as ziggurats, and they had very specific purposes. They had a central area that was called, a temple where the worship was done.
They're very old, whatever they are.
They're very old, and they're very specifically designed, to be difficult to approach. And I'm looking at this thing, and it looks a lot like the ziggurat at Ur. I mean, it's not nearly as complex, but it clearly has some similarities to that. And the first thing I did was, okay, I don't know for sure whether this is real, although I have my suspicions. So I got to send this to Richard. So I sent it to Richard, and he went, wow, that's really interesting. And we talked about it a little bit, and he did some enhancement work on it. And he put it up. And, of course, one of the things he noticed was that Daedalus is really on the opposite side of the moon from the Earth. In other words, if you were standing kind of in the middle of the Earth and looking straight up at the moon, and you could look right through the moon, you'd see, first of all, a triangular-shaped crater on the face of the moon that faces us. And about 180 degrees around from that would be this crater Daedalus and this really bizarre ziggurat kind of structure. So it was, a very fascinating thing. It appeared to have all the things you would look for in something that was artificial. So Richard came on the show one night, talked about it, put it out, and then the firestorm hit.
Yeah,
after
sure
that.
is. Why is it so controversial?
Well, there's people that were claiming, of course, it was fake. Now, the interesting thing about this is that, you know, what it clearly shows me, these guys that are critics, these debunkers that attack Richard and I and everybody else in this field, they
you got mad, too.
Well, I got really mad, but they always put stuff out that they basically implied that either Richard or I had faked it. Now, they've denied this, but they basically put the premise out there that anybody would know this is a fake from this reason and that reason and the other reason, or they must have faked it themselves. It's either they're idiots or they faked it themselves. So that really gets under my skin, because here's the laughable part. You know, there's so many artificial structures and machines and buildings and things all over the moon and all kinds of photographs. I don't even have time. I don't have, you know, neither one of us has time to go over everything that's there. There's so many things that have slipped through the cracks that are obviously artificial that it's ridiculous that we even have to fake it. But what this tells me is that they're not going to be able to fall back on their old, you know, pareidolia argument. They claim that there's this human tendency to see patterns where there are none, and that we're just seeing things. And they try to apply that to the face on Mars. But the truth is, George, there's no such thing as pareidolia. It does not exist. It never has been. The word was invented by a debunker writing for Skeptical Inquirer magazine back in the 1990s. And it's like a fake academic term that they try to use to make their implication that people just see things where there's nothing to see about life, make it sound like it's got some sort of scientific validity, which it doesn't. But the thing is, what it really told me, as soon as they started attacking Richard and attacking me, because it had my name in the file thing, so they knew that the file name, they knew that it was probably from me.
Right.
But the way they attacked it told me a couple things right away. Number one, they're really worried about this because they realize that if this thing is authenticated, then basically the jig is up. It's the Holy Grail. So that's why they had to tear it down so dramatically and really go after us with a series of what I thought were really, really weak, very, very phony attacks on the integrity of the image.
Let me ask you about the far side of the moon. As you know, Ingo Swann, the father of remote viewing, in his book Penetration, wrote about artificial structures on the far side of the moon as well. And, you know, even though this may have been somewhat of a novel, his book, he was a great remote viewer.
Yeah.
And a lot of people think he actually saw these via remote viewing. Your thoughts?
Yeah, he did. Because the cool thing about this particular photo is that it actually came with a frame number. Now, that almost never happens when you get an image like this with a photographic frame number. A lot of the best, most amazing pictures of structures on the moon don't have a NASA frame number with them. This one did, and I went and pulled it, and among other things, one of the things I found was that the ziggurat itself was pretty much erased, that they had basically drawn in fake shadows, that they had used a spray paint tool to spray paint in some shadows, but they missed all sorts of other things that are on this particular image. I think the frame number is AS11 385564, if people would like to go look that up. And all over that image, there are like vehicles, there are buildings, there is up on a hillside. You can see, it looks like a flying saucer. I mean, it looks like the Jupiter 2 from Lost in Space in a hangar that's carved out of a hillside. There is this massive drill-shaped thing that is runs along for miles and miles and miles and is attached to the hillside, and you can see all of these different wires and tubes and things that are attaching this drill head to the side of the mountain. There is what looks like, again, a sort of a beach house, like a Malibu beach house, where there's multiple layers, there's support struts underneath it, and there's just all kinds of things all over this image that are blatantly artificial. So I would guess I'd have to agree with Mr. Swann, because I'm looking at some of these pictures, and the stuff on the far side seems to be the best preserved for whatever reason.
Mike, what do you think the moon was used for? Was it a stopping-off point? What was it?
Yeah, it would have to be a stopping-off point. And, you know, look, again, I'm a believer, as we talked about, I'm a believer in the intervention theory of human evolution. I believe that our bodies, and this is just our bodies, which have nothing to do with our souls and our hearts, were probably cobbled together from our DNA or from Neanderthal DNA and the Anunnaki DNA that Sitchin talks about. At least that's my best guess at this point. And so there had to be way stations for whoever was coming from, whether it was Nibiru or someplace outside of the solar system, to get to the Earth. There probably were way stations on Mars, which is probably a lot of the structures we see there. And there would logically be a way station on the Moon. And then these bases would have been for what? Genetic experimentation, the creation of life, mining of crucial minerals. I don't know. I know, again, in that image I just mentioned, there's this. It looks like a vehicle. It looks. Did you ever see the original movie Planet of the Apes? With
Charlton Heston.
Yeah, and there's the spaceship that they arrive in, and it's this sort of wedge-shaped thing, and it's got these two blacked-out areas where the windows are.
Yeah.
Thing is sitting on top. There's a thing in this picture sitting on top of a depression that looks exactly like that spaceship. and somebody said, well, how come it has wings or it's like a lifting body if it's on the Moon? Well, if that vehicle was used to enter the Earth's atmosphere and go back and forth, then it would logically have that kind of a winged appearance. So it appears to be used, that the Moon appears to have been used for some sort of major project or projects over the centuries and the eons, and who knows what that was.
That's exciting stuff. It really is. And you've done a great job. I understand, by the way, that somebody's sending you some emails under a fake account. Tell me what's going on here and why.
Well, this guy, my chief critic in all this has been a guy named Dr. Stuart Robbins, who is some sort of, he's a rock doctor. He's a geologist out in Colorado.
He's real.
He's a real person.
He emails you?
Well, I have some critics. This one guy who is especially stalkerish. He's a very, very strange person. I'm not even going to mention his name. But this is a guy, like, he'll go in and he'll post multiple negative reviews of my books on Amazon under different assumed names.
Of course.
He even sometimes pretends to be his mother.
A sicko.
Yeah, he's whacked. But he feeds information to a lot of the bad astronomy types, the Dr. Phil Plates, and apparently this Dr. Stuart Robbins is a wannabe. He wants to be in with the Bill Nyes, the science guys, and those kind of people and be part of this group. And he's the one who really went after the ziggurat image very, very intensely. So,
and that's his opinion.
That's his
He's
opinion,
entitled to it.
And I have his opinion. And if people want to go to my blog, it's mikebara.blogspot.com and read my 6-piece complete deconstruction of everything he said. They're entitled to go read that. And anyway, after these attacks had started happening, I got this weird email, and it was from nobody at noreply.com. and it was, asking me these weird questions like, can you tell me how to calculate it and how you calculate an ellipse? And again, I know immediately this is somebody who's read this other cyber stalking person's blog, because this is one of the ridiculous things he puts out that somehow based on he somehow twists what I've said on some radio interview or in one of my books into somehow figuring out that I don't know what an ellipse is, which, by the way, it's a closed arc with both a long and a short axis. That's what it is. It doesn't necessarily even have to be closed, actually, but it works better that way. So anyway, he starts asking me these questions, and he signs it like Dan or something like that. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm not going to bite, Dan, whoever you really are. You come in here with a fake ID. I don't even know who you are. You're asking me these stupid questions that come from this cyber stalker guy. So I don't really believe in you. And he's like, well, yeah, suit yourself, blah, blah, blah. And sorry that you feel that way. And we kind of go back and forth. And then the last email, he signs it, and the sign is Stuart, S-T-U-A-R-T. And then he sends me very quickly another email saying, oh, yeah, that's not really my real name. My real name is really Dan, but I sometimes use a fake name, Stuart, when I'm doing this or doing that.
Like he made a mistake?
Yeah, like he made a mistake. And what it was, here's what it really was, is I'm 100% convinced it was this Dr. Stuart Robbins from
your opinion
from Colorado. It's my opinion.
Your opinion.
But it's spelled, Stuart can be spelled with an E-W or a U-A-R-T,
yep.
And it's spelled his way. And here's what I think happened is that he was trying to trap me into saying something he could criticize me for or attack me over. He was using, obviously, a fake email address and a fake name, but he probably had a built-in real signature, which was Stuart, and he just probably clicked send without realizing
knowing that he had
he had forgotten to change Stuart to Dan or whatever the fake name was. So that was pretty.
Why do people care to even try to destroy what you do?
Well, it's really interesting because I take it as a compliment, because what that must mean is that I'm all of a sudden becoming important. It must mean that I'm
You're
important
stepping on somebody's toes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of, I'm getting to be on Coast to Coast once in a while. I'm moving up the ladder, so I'm now worth apparently knocking off. And so, in a way, I really find it flattering, and I kind of wear the scorn as a badge of honor.
Knocking off in a figure.
Yeah, exactly. So, but the truth is, George, look, now you have the internet. Anybody can be published. Anybody can put their own stuff out there. And what there is there's just a lot of people out there. I talked about this with another very famous UFO person a couple of weeks ago. And what happens is when they hear Richard on the radio, or they hear you on the radio, they feel like, why is he the important one? I should be the important one. I'm smarter than him, and I'm better than him, and and they get jealous and they get angry, and they want to take you down because they believe that in taking you down that they somehow elevate themselves. That's one thing. And the other thing
They're
is
haters.
Yeah, but the other thing is really important is that what you're doing with this show, by letting people on it, like all the guests you have on, and I'd like to thank you for having me on, what you're doing is you are making people very uncomfortable. These guys, the Dr. Stuart Robbins of the world, they are very comfortable with their place in the scheme of things.
We're going to have to ask him on now because you've mentioned him several times.
Well,
in fairness, right?
Yeah, I won't listen. But, the thing is...
Well, you should. He may mention you a lot.
Well, okay. But, these guys, you're making them very uncomfortable because you're making them confront a reality that they do not want to confront, which is that the hierarchy and the structure that they have invested their self-esteem and their life's work in is not only based on a lie, it's also quite probably corrupt. And that's really, really hard for them to take. And so when that happens, they get scared and they get angry, and then they treat you like a heretic. And I'm not, again, I'm not comparing myself to Galileo here, but, but we're all, in a sense, we're all Galileo. It's the Galileo, it's a Galileo complex.
We're going to burn you at the stake.
They would, believe me, George, if they would love to burn you at the stake, too. They'd love to do it to all of us.
Me too?
I think so.
Mike, stay with us. We're going to come back in a moment. We're already at the top of the hour, and we will take phone calls with you next as we talk with Mike Bara here on Coast to Coast AM, his work, Ancient Aliens on the Moon. I'm going to be with him at a panel coming up the first week of October. Get full information on that by going to our website at coasttocoastam.com. Click my calendar schedule, which you'll find under hosts at the top. We'll be back. And our special guest tonight, Mike Bara. And guess what? We'll take your phone calls with him as we talk about Ancient Aliens on the Moon right here on Coast to Coast AM. Mike Bara, the Earth is so close in proximity to the moon, yet many people, yourself included, believe the moon might have been used as a base. Why not use just good old planet Earth? Or maybe they didn't want us to know they were there. What do you think it is?
Well, I'm sure they did that. I'm sure that there are places, and certainly that's what the whole Ancient Aliens milieu is about, is the evidence that there was bases right here. I think I saw something the other day that some people are claiming on Google Earth that they found some what looked like spaceports, landing ports, ancient Egyptian landing ports, which looked really pretty cool, and I haven't had a chance to really go over that yet. So certainly they could have done that. There might have been very valid reasons for being on the moon. There might have been periods of time where the Earth was inhospitable. I mean, certainly if we did experience, let's say, some catastrophic meteor strikes in the distant past, the Earth might have been a very unpleasant place for a while. So it really depends on. There's all kinds of reasons why you could have wanted to be on the moon, and it may simply be that there were mining to be done there, that there was minerals and things that were needed or desired.
Well, maybe so. But you believe, as I do, we've been to the moon, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, I think that some of these theories that we haven't, they seem to be getting, to my mind, crazier and crazier and less likely. And I guess what I keep coming back to is if, I think it was Charlie Duke who put it this way in a great film called In the Shadow of the Moon. He said, if we were going to fake it, why would we fake it 9 times? We went to the moon 9 times.
Well, that's true, too.
Yeah.
Mike, let's take some calls here. This hour's going to fly by. Let's go to Maurice in Las Vegas, west of the Rockies, first of all. Hey, Maurice, go ahead.
Yes, I used to work at Jet Propulsion Laboratories. I actually met Richard C. We just passed in the hall, that's all. But
2 ships in the night.
That's it. I was also in a monastery for a while, and while I was there, we heard about towers on the dark side of the moon, quite tall, like miles tall. Have you heard of anything of that?
Yeah, well, first of all, just to clarify, there's no dark side of the moon. There is a far side of the moon. The dark, at some point, the entire lunar surface is illuminated during the month. But yeah, I have, and in fact, in the book, in Ancient Aliens on the Moon, I show you some pictures of some of these things. And there's one Zond 3 image. It's a Russian probe image, again, of this thing that looks like an Egyptian obelisk or the or the Washington Monument. It's this gigantic tower that, at the scale of the photograph, has to be 20, 30, 40 miles high. So we do have images of this stuff, and that's what some of the glass structures are. Is they're actually support beams and support structures for these larger scaffolding kind of structures. And if the scaffolding itself had collapsed, then the beams that stick straight up would be the ones that would be left. There's not only the tower that Richard Hoagland found in Sinus Medae region, but there's an excellent picture that I go into pretty extensively of another glass spire that's sticking up from the surface of Mare Crisium, and it even has support wires and structures kind of going into it. So there's lots of pictures of that kind of thing available and that are in the book.
All right, Michael, let's go next to Cody driving in Indianapolis, first-time caller. Cody, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. It's a pleasure.
Sure thing.
So, I was just curious. This is all, I'm new at listening to Coast to Coast.
Well, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you. But I was just curious. Do you think the moon could be the 12th planet Sitchin was talking about?
Interesting question. No, because I think the moon is included in the ancient Sumerian account of 12 planets. I think it's one of the bodies that's actually included. And, the 12th planet does appear to be a foreign body, Nibiru, but of course there's a theory that Nibiru is actually a brown dwarf, and that the planet that these Anunnaki actually live on or lived on was actually a small moon that orbited this gigantic brown dwarf, and that they would be close enough that they would actually be able to get enough heat to survive and retain an atmosphere and all that stuff. So I guess to answer the question directly, no, I don't think it is the 12th planet, and it is included in the list of celestial bodies I think that the Sumerians counted. But it is a fascinating place. There are those who think it is completely artificial, and they may end up being ultimately right. And I'll just tell you this. There are some things that I know about the moon and that Richard Hoagland knows about the moon that he's never told anybody. And there's things that he knows about Mars that he's never told anybody, and hopefully in the next few weeks in some of these presentations we'll be telling you some of those things.
With all the things that you've done, Mike, the many things, the many years you've been doing this, are you at a point right now where you think we're getting close to some kind of major answers, major announcements?
No.
No.
No, never.
I keep telling Steve Bassett that too.
Yeah, Steve, God love him. We got to have him around to talk about this. But no, I don't believe in any kind of disclosure. I think we talked about this before. If they disclose this stuff officially, I'm heading for the hills. I mean, I'm on the first plane to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and hope that the catastrophe doesn't wash me away because that's the end of the line. I mean, I cannot see why anybody at the top of the power pyramid, at the top of the hierarchy, would voluntarily give up that position if they don't have to, and that's the only way it's going to come out. That's what has to happen. If there is an apocalypse, if there's a revelation or a disclosure, then the people at the top are only going to lose from that. They're only going to have less power and less influence and less wealth than they have now. And, George, that's what the whole Brookings report is about. It basically says people will go nuts. And, I see no evidence at this point to convince me that that's not true. I do think people would go a little bit wacky. I mean, you look at what's going on in the Arab world right now, and it's pretty bad all over the place. So why would they basically shoot themselves in the foot by disclosing making some sort of official announcement? And the other thing, too, is, hey, why do we need that? Why do we even need that? I mean, we have truth right in front of us. The truth is in front of us all the time. Why do we have to depend on the judgments or the authentication of these authority figures? We don't need the church or the government or the president of the corporation of the United States of America to tell us that something's real when we can look at it and know that it's real just from our own studies and our own visual inspection. So, again, to me, that's just like, it's almost like sort of being a dog and just hoping your master pats you on the head and says, "Oh, good boy, you were right all along." I mean, I don't care about that, and I don't think that is ever going to come to pass anyway.
What do some of the skeptics say about your thoughts and theories, Mike?
Well, they have a lot of criticisms, and Georgia, I take issue with the word skeptic.
How come?
I'm a skeptic. I think you're skeptical. You don't believe everything that comes on your show.
I want to investigate.
Yeah, and to me, a skeptic is someone who withholds judgment or is not willing to just sort of accept everything that they're told. These people are debunkers, and they have an agenda. And if they're on the NASA payroll, which many of them are in terms of their research grants, they have no credibility. So they say all kinds of things about me. People have created fake Facebook profiles and come in.
Welcome to the club, Michael.
Yeah, and attacked me and attacked my brother, attacked other members of my family, told me they were going to kill my cats if I didn't shut up, things like that. And it just, I don't know. I don't, at this point, it's one of these things where I really don't want to get into it with them, but every so often I feel compelled to respond. And you know how it is, George. They just whatever you answer, they'll just come up with 10 more things tomorrow for you to answer, and they take statements completely. I don't want to say out of context because that's a politician's excuse. But let me give you an example, just real quick while we got a minute.
Sure thing.
There's a thing going around to the effect that I said something on an Ancient Aliens TV show on the NASA Connection episode that is in conflict with what we wrote in Dark Mission and what I've written in Ancient Aliens on the Moon. And it has to do with the whole 19.5-degree stars above the landing site rituals and stuff that Buzz Aldrin performed in the lunar module. And what in fact happened is that they're interviewing me, and you know this, they interview you, and they took something that I said about Apollo 11, and then they spliced it together with something I said about Apollo 16, and put it together as if I was saying that this thing, that alignment that had happened on Apollo 16 had actually happened on Apollo 11. Now, you know and I know, I have no control over how they edit what I say. I have no desire to control how they edit what I say. And there's even a clear, completely obvious cut in the audio where you can clearly see that they spliced, pause, and then Mike talks about something else. Mm-hmm. And suddenly, somehow I'm responsible for the fact that what I was, made to have said on the show is not what I've previously published in other books. But again, I don't have a problem with the people at Ancient Aliens. I think they do a great job putting together great shows with good information.
I met with the executive producer a few weeks ago, and they're all excited about doing year 5.
Yeah, and I mean, it was just the way it was cut, and either they misunderstood what I explained to them, or they just thought that this sounded like a really cool soundbite. So, again, I have no control over that, but it's kind of like, are you still beating your wife? Well, again, I'm not going to sit there and waste my energy defending myself over something I never actually said.
Let's go to Keystone Heights, Florida. Bob's with us east of the Rockies. Hey, Bob, thanks.
Hey, Mr. Barra?
Yeah.
I have no problem with the notion that an advanced alien civilization may have come through the solar system at some point in the past. And even Michio Kaku said to Art Bell years ago, he said, look, or maybe you, George, I'm sorry.
That's right.
He said, look, he says, if this has happened, then the best place to look for alien artifacts is on the moon. So I have no problem with that. However, I do have a problem with the ziggurat and the other evidence. I've read Dark Mission. I've read Monuments of Mars. I have one of Richard's videos. I have problems with the evidence, and I, with all due respect, consider it utter rubbish. The problem with your analysis is you're not incorporating the latest imagery, ultra-high resolution sub-meter images from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter that NASA now has orbiting the moon, wide-angle and narrow-angle images. If these artifacts are real, and it would be wonderful if they were because we'd get all kinds of funding for space programs, you're not looking at that data. You're looking at Lunar Orbiter images from the 60s, like Lunar Orbiter image, Lunar Orbiter 5 is the one that the ziggurat image came from, I believe, or it could have been Apollo, I'm not sure. A couple months ago, I looked at that image. I, for the life of me, cannot find what you say is in that image. It looks photoshopped. I'm not an expert on that. You need to look at the latest high-resolution sub-meter images of the lunar surface, of which I think more than half the lunar surface has now been imaged in sub-meter resolution. You'll also have complete coverage by the wide-angle cameras. If your evidence is real, Mr. Barra, it should be in that data. And if it's been fabricated or doctored by NASA, then you should be able to pull out crops, screen captures of those areas, and you can compare and analyze that. I've not seen Richard talk about that, and I like Richard. I enjoy when he's on the show. I'm just trying to be honest with you. You need to look at the latest data, not decades-old Lunar Orbiter or Apollo data.
And Bob, but I got to tell you, and I want Mike to react to this. You seem like you know your thing. Do you work in the business?
I've been an amateur astronomer for 47 years. I exclusively observe the moon. I'm a member of the Association of Lunar and Planetary Observers, the British Astronomical Association, and the chair of the Lunar Observing Group of the Alachua Astronomy Club. I have a forthcoming paper on transient lunar phenomena that's been accepted by a British journal. So I have no problem with anomalies on the moon. I have a problem with the evidence that's been presented so far in everything I've looked at, and I've looked at this for years. I'm unconvinced, and where is it in the data we're getting now? All
right, Michael, I'll let you react to this, and of course, he thinks you need to look at other imaging, but go ahead.
Well, first of all, I didn't hear the whole tirade. I got cut off part of the way through, but it sounded like this sort of standard, seminar calling stuff that there's a reason why first of all, I do look at LROC imaging. I do look at that. I've looked at it very recently. Most of it does not even cover the areas in question in any sort of decent resolution most of the time. In a lot of cases, the imagery is at very, very high straight-up sun angles, which makes it really impossible to get any sort of lights and shadow effects. And you need shading, you need shadows to be able to determine shape from shading. For instance, you can look at Copernicus, and there's a very, very interesting oblique image of the crater Copernicus. The frame number escapes me, but it's in the book. It's in Ancient Aliens on the Moon. And it clearly shows all kinds of artificial structures on the rim of the crater Copernicus, including the power plant or the rebel base on Hoth that we talked about earlier, which is unmistakable, indisputable, artificial. Anybody with eyes can see that it's artificial. And that is taken at a very oblique angle. Now, if you look at imagery of that area from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, not only is that specific area not really covered, but under the lighting conditions, the whole surface of the area looks completely flat and completely smooth. Now, my conclusion is from that information is that there's only really two answers. Either without the sun coming in at a bit of an angle, you're not able to see all of the very complex terrain that's there, or it's been whitewashed by NASA. And the truth is that in my experience, NASA has whitewashed information. We've probably caught them at it 15 to 18 times. So the reality is, no, I don't trust anything that's purely digital. I don't trust any of that stuff that comes out of there. The only time anything seems to slip through in the digital imagery is when they simply do not understand or do not catch that the image exists in the first place. This Daedalus ziggurat image, for instance, there's a whole bunch of photographs that were taken of the area, including the main frame, 5564. Now, there were two different cameras with two different film magazines that took a bunch of pictures, some in color and some in black and white. And they were all on one photographic image map that was all marked out So if anybody decided, there's this pyramid thing on this picture, we should probably erase that before we put it up on the web, they would be able to go to this map and see all of the other pictures that showed the exact same thing or showed the area. And every single one of those pictures, the thing doesn't exist. It looks completely gone. It's completely whitewashed. It's flat. There's nothing there, right? But there were 2 other images that were taken at the same time on the same mission on Apollo 11 by one of the astronauts with a third camera, but they were on a different photographic map. Therefore, if you were kind of being sloppy, you wouldn't know that these other images even existed, and both of them show the ziggurat exactly as it is depicted in the controversial picture, the one that we got off the web, the one that I believe is genuine for a whole bunch of other reasons. Now, I'll tell you something else.
All right, 30 seconds, Mike.
The imagery that I do trust is the first-generation print imagery that I can get from people like Ken Johnston Jr., and I do look at all the old imagery because that stuff, a lot more stuff has slipped through the cracks from the older stuff than from the newer stuff. The LROC stuff, again, I'm interested in the area of the crater Tycho, and the bottom line is that the reconnaissance orbiter image is supposed to be much, much better than the Clementine data that I've been working on from Tycho, but it looks exactly the same. They've de-resed it. So, again, my experience with NASA is they're not honest. I don't trust the new data. I work with the old stuff because that's where I see what I think is the real ground truth.
We're coming back for final phone calls in just a moment, right here on Coast to Coast AM. On our next Coast to Coast program, Hugh Simpson joins us, former CBS television reporter. His work 2012 and beyond, preparing for the perfect fiscal and physical storm. Make sure you're part of that exciting Coast to Coast show. And when we roll right back in just a moment, your final questions with Mike Barra on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Mike Barra with us here on Coast to Coast. And, of course, your final questions indeed. Mike, what is after Ancient Aliens? I'm sure you're always working.
Well, yeah, I am. We've got Ancient Aliens on the Moon, of course, is out now. And for 2013, there's going to be an Ancient Aliens on Mars. So we're going to move on from Ancient Aliens on the Moon to Ancient Aliens on Mars next year. And I do have some other things that I cannot talk about that are really exciting for 2013. Let me put it this way. I'm working really hard to drop that extra 10 pounds the camera puts on you.
Good for you. Keep at it. It's not too hard. Just stay off. You'll know what to do. Yeah. I'm not going to give you the George diet.
Well, yeah.
But
you know my habits, George. You know what I have to avoid, right?
That's right. Let's go to Dan in DeWitt, Iowa on the wild card line. Hey, Dan, welcome to the program.
Thanks, George. Good morning, and thanks for taking my call.
You're welcome.
Mike, I want to assure you my name really is Dan. I'm not Stan or Stuart. The question I have for you is, I can buy extraterrestrials on Mars, on the Moon. I can buy the Anunnaki coming here and genetically engineering us as a civilization. I can even buy ancient civilizations living on the planet Earth. What I've never been able to figure out is, with all the resources that we have on this planet, why do we only find stone structures, stone ruins? I would think that they would have wanted to be as comfortable as we are and used stone structures and built skyscrapers, and yet we don't find any of that.
Well, remember that on Earth, Earth is an extremely erosive environment.
Oh, it sure is.
Mars is not. Mars is like a giant refrigerator. So really, if you had skyscrapers on Mars, they would be able to be preserved significantly longer. And on the Moon, as long as they were protected from meteors by, 20-mile-high glass scaffolding, multi-layered structures, it could last even longer than that. So, Earth is just a very erosive environment. I think, and I'm not sure of the exact dating, but I do believe that it's been calculated that if everything were to stop right now, that within 10,000 years, you would not even be able to tell that New York City ever existed. In other words, it would just be nothing but
maybe even less.
Yeah, it would be just a pile. I can't remember if it was 1,000 years or 10,000 years. It would just be a pile of dust and different various metals and so forth. You'd find a lot of iron and steel and everything would be broken down to the base elements, and you'd never even know there was a city there. And interestingly, as Sitchin, again, we're back to Zecharia Sitchin, as he pointed out, there are several locations in southern Africa where he said that the Anunnaki stories talked about there being major ports and cities where they have found these exact sort of widespread mixtures of the kinds of materials that would have made up a city had there once been a city there.
It is amazing at what could happen over just a period of years. I think it was Discovery Channel that did that.
Yeah, the Earth without people or something like
just
that.
Nothing.
Yeah, and I mean, who wants an Earth without people? I mean, that's what it's here for, right?
Very lonely.
Yeah.
Pueblo, Colorado, it's Mark's turn. Hey, Mark, go ahead.
All right. First of all, thank you very much for having me on.
You're welcome.
Appreciate that. But I just want to let you know that Life After People show, that was on the History Channel.
Okay.
But anyway, what I was going to say is, first of all, I'm a big Robert Anton Wilson, the writer, big fan of his, so I like to consider myself militant agnostic. I don't say I believe in anything. I try and keep my mind open. But as far as, like, moon landings and whatnot, I was actually just having a conversation with my buddy about my disbelief in people's ideas that the moon landings were hoaxed. And I know that's not your position at all. But if they were to have been hoaxed, and I kind of think that this might be a possibility, that it would not be because we couldn't get to the moon, but because we possess technology even beyond that. And in fact, I kind of theorize that a lot of the UFOs that people see are our technology. I think the human race is a lot more capable than what a lot of people give us credit for. And that's actually one of my beefs with Ancient Aliens, is kind of shortchanging humans, that even in ancient times we were probably way more advanced than we are now. Not that aliens weren't around, but even possibly these structures that may or may not be on the moon might be from much older human civilizations. And just kind of thought what your ideas or what your thoughts are about our own past, completely independent from ancient aliens.
That's a possibility, Mike.
Yeah, it is, and we discussed that earlier, you know, and we talked about the Hopi legends that essentially say exactly what you're saying, which is that, you know, there have been previous versions of man, previous very advanced civilizations, and that they had technology well beyond what we have today, and that they may have built a lot of this stuff, and then it was abandoned. And, you know, again, people ask a lot of times, George, about why cover this up? Why would NASA want to cover stuff up? And the reason is that, you know, if you come out and you say, hey, by the way, we've discovered artifacts of a very, very super advanced civilization that once existed on the moon, the first question you're going to get at that press conference is, well, what happened to them? And if the answer is, well, they were wiped out in some sort of solar system-wide cataclysm that destroyed a planet that Mars was once a moon of and wiped out the dinosaurs on the Earth and caused all kinds of other problems, you're going to set off a general panic. Or if you say something even crazier, like, well, we think there was a war between humans and their own machines or something, it's going to get even worse. So the thing is that that idea is very seductive, and it's very smart, and it's very probable that this really isn't ancient aliens in the true sense. It's alien to this current civilization, but that it's somehow related to us in a very, very far distant past. That makes complete sense to me, and I support the caller's idea. I think that's pretty much the conclusion I've come to, is that these things really aren't necessarily so much the standard sort of gray aliens, but they're really our ancestors or our brothers or sisters or cousins.
Let's go to Stuart in Boulder, Colorado. I don't think he's the one you've been talking about, though. Hey, Stuart, go ahead.
Hi, George.
Hi, Stu.
I'm the guy that Mike was talking about.
Oh, you are?
Oh.
I was going to get you on to do your own rebuttal, but if you want a quick question or two, go ahead.
Up now, and you can call me later.
All right, we're going to get your number, but do you have a quick question for Mike before you go?
I did. My main question for Mike was I wanted to know what it would take to falsify his belief in the ziggurat.
I would have to see a first-generation print from somebody who had held it since the very early days of Apollo, somebody like Ken Johnston. I would have to have that. I would have to verify its authenticity, scan it, and there would have to be virtually nothing there. But that's not even going to happen because I already have two other images, 6613 and 6614, which confirm most of what is seen in the ziggurat image that we've put out before. So that's what it would take. I would have to see something that was truly authentic. And, what I'd like to find out from you is what it would take to falsify your belief that this is a fake. And, you laid out 3 very specific criteria, all of which I completely destroyed in my analysis on my blog, and people can go to my blog and read it and decide for themselves. But you set out 3 standards of proof, all of which I believe very clearly I met. So what would it take for you to admit that this thing is probably a legitimate image?
Well, so actually, I did respond to your blog post on my own blog, but obviously we can't really play blog tag on the
blog.
Left. Basically, I disagree with what you said. I don't think that you, as you put it, destroyed my arguments, and people can go to my blog and see why I say that. But basically, for example, I really don't like to use this word, but I'll use it anyway. I believe or trust other images from other spacecraft. The one with the ziggurat for you comes from I think it's the Call of Duty Zombies forum. And that's really one of the only sources that you have for this, whereas there are so many other images taken by other craft, including non-NASA ones, that have imaged the site at very high resolution, as a caller about 20 minutes ago said, and yet you just dismiss those pretty much because you say it doesn't have the ziggurat, therefore it's fake. And so I'm curious, actually, you said that you would like to verify an original print's authenticity. How would you go about doing that? What would make it, to you, say that something is authentic, as opposed to, say, the Selene images from the Japanese spacecraft that imaged that region at 10 meter per pixel resolution?
Well, first of all, the Selene image is full of artifacts, and you can see that from what I produced, and those artifacts were deliberately induced by the Japanese. Secondly, as I've told you before, I have many, many occasions, maybe a dozen, 15, 18, 20, 25 at this point, where NASA has been deceptive or has overtly lied or altered imagery before. So, again, I don't trust their source information. What makes it authentic for me is the fact that I know that it's been outside of NASA's control for decades. And this was back in the days when people were able to slip things out the door before they started putting the clamps on this. So, again, that's, I would trust what I got from Ken Johnson's information, Ken Johnson's collection, more than I would trust anything posted on any website by NASA, simply because of my life experience of spending the last 15 years dealing with their politics and their BS and their false claims about the face on Mars and their false claims about the D&M pyramid on Mars and all the other things that have come out, the false claims they made about the MOLA instrument, the Mars Orbiter Laser Altimeter. They've made all kinds of false claims.
You two would be a good debate there, Michael.
Well, again, George, if you want to debate, I really have one question for Stuart.
Stuart is now giving his number to Tom. So.
Well, what I'd like to know.
Let's save it in case I have him on.
Well, okay, what I'd like to know at this point is, are you the guy that under the fake email name sent me those email messages to my Gmail account?
And I'll let you ask him that if he ever comes back on, all right?
I lost him. Okay. Well, so, again, I first of all, I applaud him for having the guts to come on. I have a feeling that deep down somewhere there's a nice guy.
Well,
but
is he the guy? That's the other.
Well, again, if you're going to stoop to that level, that's pretty ridiculous. And the truth is, look, these guys are debunkers. They have an agenda, and the agenda is to make sure that people that like me and like you
but keep in mind,
are not taken seriously.
They all, even those who are opposed to what we all do, they have a right to say that. That's what this country's all about, and that doesn't bother me. I'll go toe-to-toe with all of them. You should, too.
Well, I will, except that what the real desire is on the part of people like James Oberg and Phil Plait, and now I guess we can throw Stuart in there. And congratulations, Stuart. You've now made it up to their level. Their objective is to get you to spend all of your energy defending yourself against attack after attack after attack, rather than looking for new information, rather than putting new stuff out. So, again, I only respond occasionally, and I only respond, George, in this case, I responded to him because of his very strong implication that either Richard or I had fabricated this image. He said he wouldn't put it past us that we had done this. Well, I'd like to hear from him at some point whether he's now prepared to put it past us for doing something like that, because the truth is we don't have to. And I would encourage everybody to go to the image including the guy from Colorado or the other guy that called in, Bob or whatever his name was. Go look at that image. Go look at AS11 38 55 64, and you don't have to believe in the ziggurat at all. Look at the rest of that picture. There's artificial buildings, structures, mechanisms, vehicles all over that image, and they are completely obvious to anybody who's ever even put together a model car or a model flying saucer.
Well, the greatest part of this show, Michael, is everybody has a right to make up their own minds, and that's what's so good. Let's take a few more calls, and we're out of time. Tony in Shiloh, Illinois. Hey, Tony, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, George. I just wanted to make a comment real quick about Ancient Aliens. I love it, but I have to say UFO Hunters was the best show. They really went out of their way, as opposed to the current show that is on called Chasing UFOs, which is absolutely the opposite, and it kind of reminds me of, just complete
UFO
channeling.
Hunters was more of a newsy type approach. I like that.
Yeah,
Bill
exactly.
Burns and group did a great job.
And
Bill's
they
got a new
did
book
little
coming
homework, and it was
of course, yeah.
I wanted to ask Mike where that of the smokestack that was a while back, probably in early 2002 or something, and the supposed space vehicle location of the moon, and if not, are you aware of the Apollo photographs of the cigar-shaped or submarine-shaped object?
Yeah, I've seen that picture, repeatedly, and I don't know what it is, to be quite honest with you. It looks to me like it could actually be something in front of the camera, very close to the camera. But here's the thing. I've never seen a frame number associated with it. And while some people out in the audience may not believe that I have any standards, the truth is, unless it comes with an actual Apollo image number that I can go and do some investigation and look at, I just can't place any validity on it. I mean, that cigar-shaped thing, I have seen it many times. It looks to me like it's a lunar orbiter photo, but I don't know for sure. But it certainly is interesting, and I certainly encourage everybody to keep digging. But I really need, an image number, a photograph number to go look it up and start doing some work on it.
All right, let's get another quick call in. First-time caller, Daryl in Kent, Ohio. Daryl, go ahead.
Hi, guys. God bless Art Bell, and long live Coast to Coast. 50 years ago, I built a telescope, and I've been skeptical ever since. They send the Hubble telescope up, and all you got to do is look through the thing to know if it works. I mean, how insane is that? Anyway, my question was after rovers. I see these rovers. They look like they were made by the guys who developed transformers. Why couldn't they make helium zeppelins that would never get stuck, that could go up 20 miles? That was one of the ideas I had.
How do you do that, Mike? We only have 30 seconds left.
I don't know. I'm not Edison. I'm not great at inventing stuff like that. You mean for Mars?
Probably.
You've got a really good camera up there, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, assuming you can trust what you get back. And you've got the rovers on the ground, so we're kind of covering things from both above and below. And the next step is to have, they've talked about little glider planes and things like that to fly around with cameras, and I think that would be really cool.
Name of the book, Ancient Aliens by Mike Barra, his website, of course, and blog, all linked up for you at coasttocoastam.com. Mike, as usual, thanks again.
And thank you, George, for having me.
You take care of yourself, and we shall be back with another edition of Coast to Coast tomorrow. For Dan Galante, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladouceur, Stephanie Smith, George Knapp, John B. Wells, Ian Punnett, and Art Bell, I'm George Norrie. Somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe, everyone.